The Art of War, Winning Without Fighting. Sun Tzu's Timeless Strategies for Modern Life, Work, Business, and Relationships. Author, Roko. Dedication, for the person you are becoming. Quote, "The art of war is of vital importance. It is a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or to ruin." Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Introduction. Why a 2,500-year-old book about war is the most useful thing you'll read this year. There is a book that has been continuously in print for over 2,000 years. It has been carried into battle by generals, studied in the boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies, assigned in military academies from West Point to Sandhurst, and quoted in everything from corporate strategy presentations to self-help podcasts. It is 63 pages long. It was written by a Chinese military strategist sometime around 500 BC. And there is a reasonable chance that until now, you have never read it, or if you have, you read it as an interesting historical curiosity rather than a living instruction manual for your actual life. This book is an attempt to change that. The Art of War by Sun Tzu is not really about war. It never was. It uses the language of armies and generals and terrain because those were the stakes of Sun Tzu's world. The consequences of poor strategy were measured in bodies and kingdoms. But the underlying subject is something far more universal: how to think clearly, act effectively, and navigate conflict and competition in a world that is complex, unpredictable, and rarely arranged for your convenience. The battlefield was simply the context in which these ideas were forged. The ideas themselves belong to every human being who has ever had to make a difficult decision, compete for something they wanted, manage a relationship that required more than good intentions, or try to build something meaningful in conditions that weren't cooperating. Which is to say, the ideas belong to you. Why now? You might reasonably ask why we need another version of The Art of War in 2026. There have been dozens, perhaps hundreds, of adaptations, translations, and reframings over the decades. Most of them do one of two things. Either they stay so close to the original military context that the modern reader has to do all the translation work themselves, extracting the principle from the battlefield language and figuring out how it applies to their Tuesday morning. Or they narrow the application to a single domain, usually business, occasionally leadership, and ignore the rest of a person's life entirely. This book does neither of those things. What you are holding is a complete, chapter-by-chapter engagement with Sun Tzu's original 13 chapters, applied across the full breadth of a modern human life. Not just your career. Not just your business strategy. But also your relationships, your inner life, your decision-making under pressure, your management of your own energy and attention, and your navigation of the daily complexity that 2026 specifically presents in ways that no previous era quite did. Because the world has changed in ways that make Sun Tzu's thinking more relevant, not less. The pace of information has accelerated to the point where acting before thinking has become the default mode for most people in most situations. The complexity of navigating modern organizations, digital environments, and social dynamics has increased faster than our instincts have adapted. The number of decisions a person makes in a day about attention, about resources, about relationships, about risk has expanded dramatically, while the wisdom infrastructure to support those decisions has not kept pace. Sun Tzu's core proposition, think before you act, know yourself and your situation clearly, choose your ground carefully, and apply the right force at the right moment, is not just still valid. In a world of relentless noise, impulsive reaction, and strategic drift, it is more urgently needed than ever. What this book is. Each of the 13 chapters follows a consistent structure designed to take you from Sun Tzu's original thinking to practical application in a single sitting. You will find the original wisdom, a faithful, plain language summary of what Sun Tzu actually said, without the archaic phrasing. This is Sun Tzu's thinking, rendered clearly and completely, so that you understand where every subsequent idea comes from. Following that, you will find the core principles, a distilled set of the chapter's key ideas, stated plainly enough to be remembered and used rather than simply read and forgotten. Then comes the section that is the heart of the book, the modern applications. For each chapter, you will find Sun Tzu's thinking applied across 4 domains of contemporary life: your work and career, your business or entrepreneurial endeavors, your relationships, and your own mind. These are not loose analogies or stretched metaphors. They are direct, specific, and practical, the kind of thinking you can take into a real situation and use. At the end of each application section, you will find field notes, brief exercises, or reflection questions designed to move you from reading to doing. This book was written to be used, not just appreciated. A note on Sun Tzu. Very little is known with certainty about Sun Tzu himself. The name may refer to a single historical figure, a general named Sun Wu who served the king of Wu in ancient China around 500 BC, or it may be a composite identity, the accumulated wisdom of multiple strategists writing across a longer period. The debate among scholars is genuine and unresolved. What is not in dispute is the text itself, its extraordinary compression of insight, its structural coherence, its refusal to be reduced to simple maxims without losing something essential. Whoever wrote it understood human nature, competition, conflict, and the relationship between knowledge and action with a precision that most writers across the subsequent 2.5 millennia have not surpassed. This book treats Sun Tzu's text with the respect that precision deserves. The original ideas are represented faithfully before they are built upon. Where this book departs from the original, as it must, in applying ancient military thinking to modern life, it does so transparently, not by distorting what Sun Tzu said but by extending where his thinking leads. The goal throughout is to honor the source while making it genuinely useful for the life you are actually living. One last thing before you begin. This is not a book to be skimmed. These are not ideas to be agreed with and then set aside. Every chapter contains something that, taken seriously and applied honestly, has the potential to change how you operate in the world. The generals who studied Sun Tzu and understood him deeply did not simply find him interesting. They found him useful in the most consequential sense of that word. That is what this book is for. The battlefield is different now. The principles are not. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Laying plans. Think before you move. Calculate before you speak. Prepare before you act. The original wisdom. Sun Tzu opens The Art of War with a statement that might be the most important sentence in the entire book: the art of war is of vital importance to the state. It is a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or to ruin. In other words, don't take this lightly. Before a single soldier moves, before a single arrow is fired, Sun Tzu insists on 5 fundamental factors that determine the outcome of any conflict. He calls them the moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, and method and discipline. In plain language, he's asking 5 questions. Do your people believe in what they're fighting for? What are the conditions outside your control: timing, weather, circumstance? What is the actual terrain you're operating on? Is your leader someone people will follow through difficulty? And is there a clear, disciplined plan for how this all gets executed? Sun Tzu's key insight is that the general who answers these 5 questions honestly, and whose answers are stronger than their opponents, wins before the battle begins. Victory, he argues, is not something you achieve in the chaos of fighting. It's something you manufacture in the quiet before the fight starts. He goes further. He says you must compare your situation to your enemies across all 5 factors. Where are you stronger? Where are they weaker? Where are the gaps you can exploit? This is not paranoia, it's precision. The general who goes to war without this analysis is not brave, Sun Tzu says. They're reckless. There's also a line in this chapter that often gets overlooked: all warfare is based on deception. Sun Tzu doesn't mean lie to everyone. He means, don't show your full hand before you need to. When you're strong, appear uncertain. When you're ready to move, appear still. This is not manipulation, it's strategic patience. The entire first chapter is essentially a case for one habit: thinking before acting. Most people lose in life not because they lack talent or resources, but because they act before they've properly assessed the situation. They take the job without researching the company culture. They launch the product without understanding the competition. They send the angry text without thinking about what they actually want to achieve. Sun Tzu saw this 2,500 years ago. Nothing has changed. The core principles. Every important endeavor deserves serious analysis before you begin. Treat your plans as a matter of life and death, not an afterthought. 5 things determine outcomes: belief in the cause, external conditions, the terrain, the quality of leadership, and the discipline of execution. The side that answers these questions most honestly wins before the contest starts. Victory is manufactured in preparation, not discovered in the middle of a crisis. Compare yourself to the competition honestly, where you're strong, where you're weak, and where the real opportunities are. Don't reveal your full strategy prematurely. Strategic patience is a form of power. Recklessness dressed up as boldness is still recklessness. Briefcase apply at work. You're up for a promotion. Your first instinct is to walk into your manager's office and make your case. That's the reckless general charging into battle. Before you move, do what Sun Tzu would do: analyze the 5 factors. Do you genuinely believe in what you're asking for, and does your track record back it up? What are the external conditions right now? Is the company in a cost-cutting phase, or a growth phase? What's the terrain? Is your manager the decision maker, or does this go higher? Is your relationship with your manager strong enough to have this conversation? And do you have a clear, structured case ready? Most people lose career battles not because they don't deserve the outcome, but because they fight on bad ground at the wrong time with no plan. Before any high-stakes conversation, a salary negotiation, a difficult confrontation, a pitch for a new idea, write down your 5 factors. The clarity alone will change how you enter the room. And remember Sun Tzu's note on deception: don't tip your hand too early. If you're job hunting, don't announce it. If you're planning a big move at work, let it happen before you broadcast it. Information is leverage, and you give it away cheaply when you share too soon. Field notes. Before your next important work conversation, answer these 3 questions in writing. What do I actually want from this? What do they want? What's the realistic outcome if I'm wrong about either? Office building apply in business. Every failed startup has a version of the same story. Someone had a great idea, got excited, and started building before they truly understood the market. They skipped the planning chapter. Sun Tzu's 5 factors translate directly to business strategy. The moral law is your why. Do your customers, your team, and you yourself actually believe in what this company exists to do? Heaven is market timing. Are you entering a rising tide or a retreating one? Earth is your competitive landscape. What does the ground actually look like? The commander is your leadership. Do you have the skills and temperament this particular business requires? And method and discipline is your execution system. Can you actually do the thing repeatedly, at scale, under pressure? Great entrepreneurs aren't just visionary. They're obsessive planners who understand their situation clearly before they commit. Jeff Bezos famously wrote a press release for Amazon products before they were built, imagining the finished product from the customer's perspective as a planning tool. That's Sun Tzu thinking. The deception principle matters here too. In a competitive market, don't announce your next move until you're ready to execute it. Competitors can't copy what they don't know is coming. Field notes. Run your current business idea or project through all 5 factors. Be brutally honest. Where are you genuinely strong? Where are you lying to yourself? The answer to the second question is where your real work is. Red heart apply in relationships. Planning doesn't sound romantic. But think about how many relationship problems come from exactly the kind of recklessness Sun Tzu warns against. You have a difficult conversation without thinking about what you actually want from it, and it spirals. You make a big shared decision, moving in together, having a child, combining finances, without honestly assessing whether both people are genuinely aligned on the 5 factors. You show all your emotional cards too early in a new relationship and then wonder why the dynamic shifted. This isn't about being cold or calculated with the people you love. It's about being intentional. When a hard conversation needs to happen about money, about a pattern of behavior, about the future, the most caring thing you can do is think carefully before you speak. What do you want the outcome to be? What does the other person need to hear in order to receive what you're saying? What's the right moment for this conversation? Sun Tzu's principle about not fighting on bad ground is profoundly practical in relationships. Bringing up a serious issue when your partner is exhausted, rushed, or already defensive is choosing the worst terrain possible. You may be right about the issue and still lose the conversation because you picked the wrong moment. Field notes. Think of a recurring conflict in an important relationship. Ask honestly, have I ever approached this conversation with a clear sense of what outcome I actually want? If not, write that outcome down before the next attempt. Brain apply in your own mind. The enemy Sun Tzu doesn't name explicitly, but who appears on every page is impulse. Most of the bad decisions in your life probably weren't made in the middle of deep reflection. They were made quickly, emotionally, and without honest self-assessment. You said yes to the wrong thing because the opportunity felt exciting in the moment. You quit something good because a difficult week made it feel impossible. You stayed in something bad because leaving required a plan, and plans are uncomfortable. Self-knowledge is the foundation of Sun Tzu's entire system. Know yourself is not a soft, feel-good idea. It's a strategic imperative. If you don't know where your weaknesses are, you can't protect them. If you don't know what conditions bring out your worst decisions, you'll keep making them. Try this. Think about the last significant decision you made that you regret. At what point did you make it? Was it in a calm, clear state, or was it made in a rush, under pressure, or in an emotional spike? Almost certainly the latter. The habit of laying plans, even a 10-minute pause before an important decision, is one of the highest leverage things you can build into your life. Field notes. Identify your 3 bad decision conditions, the emotional or situational states in which you consistently make poor choices: tired, angry, feeling overlooked, excited by novelty. Write them down. Make a simple rule: no major decisions when any of these conditions are active. Chapter takeaway. The person who wins most consistently isn't the most talented, the most aggressive, or the luckiest. They're the one who thinks longest and most honestly before they move. Chapter 2. Waging war. Every conflict has a cost. The longer it runs, the more it takes from you, whether you're winning or not. The original wisdom. Sun Tzu's second chapter opens with numbers. Specific, sobering numbers. He lists the resources required to wage war: the chariots, the armor, the arrows, the provisions, and then delivers his central point. When you engage in actual fighting, if victory is long in coming, the men's weapons will grow dull and their ardor will be diminished. Keep an army in the field too long, and it doesn't just cost money. It costs spirit. It costs sharpness. It costs the will to keep going. This chapter is not really about war. It's about the hidden cost of prolonged effort, and why speed, efficiency, and knowing when to end something are just as important as knowing how to fight. Sun Tzu makes a point that surprises most first-time readers. He says a wise general feeds his army from the enemy's land rather than shipping supplies from home. Every resource that travels a long distance gets depleted along the way. The closer your resources are to where they're needed, the less waste. This is logistics thinking at its finest, and it applies far beyond military campaigns. He also introduces a principle that modern psychology would eventually confirm thousands of years later: prolonged conflict changes people. It makes them harder, more desperate, less rational. A negotiation that should have taken a week and drags into a month starts to produce bad agreements, not because the underlying issues changed, but because the people involved are exhausted and just want it over. A project that goes months over schedule doesn't just cost money. It demoralizes the team, erodes trust, and often produces worse work than a faster, leaner version would have. Sun Tzu's prescription is blunt: in war, then, let your great object be victory, not lengthy campaigns. He's not saying rush carelessly. He's saying that speed of resolution, when paired with adequate preparation, is itself a form of excellence. The general who wins quickly and cleanly is more skilled than the one who grinds out a long, costly victory. There is a deeper wisdom running underneath all of this. Sun Tzu understood something about human energy that most people only discover after burning through it. It is finite, it depletes faster under stress than we expect, and once it's gone, it doesn't come back quickly. Protecting your energy, your resources, your people's morale, your own focus is not laziness. It is strategy. The chapter ends with a line worth tattooing somewhere visible: there is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. Replace country with your name. Replace warfare with whatever drawn-out battle you're currently in the middle of. The question isn't whether you can survive a long fight. It's whether surviving it is actually winning. The core principles. Every conflict, project, and campaign has a cost, and that cost compounds the longer things drag on. Speed of resolution, when backed by solid preparation, is a mark of skill, not impatience. Human energy, morale, and focus are finite resources that must be managed as carefully as money. Prolonged battles change the people fighting them, often for the worse, regardless of the outcome. Source your resources as close to where they're needed as possible. Reduce the distance between effort and result. The goal is victory, not the performance of effort. Looking busy is not the same as moving forward. Knowing when to end something and ending it cleanly is one of the most underrated strategic skills. Briefcase apply at work. There is a particular kind of professional suffering that nobody talks about enough: the slow-burning project that never quite ends. You know the one. It started with clear goals and genuine energy. Somewhere around month 3 it started drifting. Deadlines moved. Scope expanded. The people involved stopped being excited and started being resigned. By the time it finally limps to completion or quietly gets shelved, everyone involved is a little more cynical than they were before. Sun Tzu would diagnose this immediately: you waged a long campaign when a short one was possible. Somewhere along the way, the cost of continuing exceeded the value of the outcome, but no one had the clarity or authority to call it. The professional application of this chapter is twofold. First, develop a genuine allergy to unnecessary prolongation. Meetings that could be emails. Decisions that sit in committee for weeks. Feedback cycles that loop endlessly without resolution. Every one of these is a supply line stretched too far, burning resources without producing victory. Second, learn to recognize the cost of performing effort rather than producing results. Many workplace cultures reward presence, busyness, and the appearance of hard work over actual outcomes. Sun Tzu has zero patience for this. If the goal is victory, everything that isn't moving you toward victory is waste, and waste, at scale, loses wars. One practical reframe: before committing to any significant work initiative, ask not just "can we do this," but "what does done actually look like, and what's our deadline for deciding this isn't working?" Building an exit condition into the beginning of a project is not pessimism. It's the kind of thinking that saves teams from the 6-month slog. Field notes. Identify one ongoing project or commitment in your professional life that has been running longer than it should. Ask honestly: is this still moving toward a clear victory, or am I continuing out of sunk cost and momentum? What would it look like to resolve it, one way or another, in the next 2 weeks? Office building apply in business. Businesses die in 2 ways. The dramatic way, the sudden crisis, the funding collapse, the catastrophic mistake, and the slow way, which is far more common and far less discussed. The slow way is running long campaigns you can't afford. Cash is the obvious resource Sun Tzu would point to. Every month a startup spends without reaching profitability or a clear funding milestone is a month of supply line stretched thin. The longer the campaign, the more it costs, not just in money, but in the attention of your team, the patience of your investors, the energy of your founders. Many businesses that ran out of money didn't actually fail financially first. They failed in morale and clarity, and the money ran out shortly after. But the principle goes beyond cash. Think about your customer acquisition process. If closing a sale takes 6 months of nurturing, check-ins, and proposals, you're running a long campaign for every single client. What would it take to make that process shorter and sharper? Not by cutting corners, but by getting clearer, faster, about whether there's a real match. Think about your competitive battles. If a rival enters your market and your instinct is to outspend, outfeature, and outshout them across every front, Sun Tzu would pull you aside. That's a prolonged war of attrition, and unless you have dramatically more resources than they do, the longer it runs the worse your odds become. The smarter move is often to pick one front where you can win decisively and quickly, then move. The most dangerous business version of this chapter is the pivot that never quite happens. A company knows its original model isn't working, starts exploring alternatives, but never fully commits to the new direction, continuing to half fund the old thing while half exploring the new one. This is the worst of all possible positions. You're waging two long campaigns simultaneously, winning neither. Field notes. Name one area of your business where you are spending resources, time, money, or people's energy without a clear, near-term path to a defined outcome. Set a date, no more than 30 days away, by which you will either see measurable progress or make a definitive change. Red Heart apply in relationships. This is the section of the chapter people most need to read and will most resist. Prolonged conflict in relationships doesn't just fail to solve problems, it creates new ones. The couple who has the same argument every few weeks, year after year, isn't just failing to resolve the original issue. They're accumulating damage. Each repetition leaves a small residue, a little more defensiveness, a little more hopelessness, a little more distance. The argument itself becomes the problem, on top of whatever the original issue was. Sun Tzu's insight here isn't that you should rush important conversations or avoid necessary difficulty. It's that unresolved conflict has a cost that people consistently underestimate. Most people treat relationship tension as something that can sit indefinitely, brought out occasionally, fought about, then put away again. But it doesn't sit still. It compounds. The practical application is learning to fight with resolution as the actual goal, not validation, not winning, not releasing frustration, but genuinely resolving the thing so it doesn't need to come back. That requires being willing to say what you actually need, not just what you're upset about, to listen for what the other person actually needs, and to reach a real agreement rather than a temporary ceasefire. There's also a gentler version of this principle that applies to relationships that have simply run their course. Sometimes the most honest and caring thing you can do for yourself and the other person is to recognize that continuing to invest in something that isn't working is not loyalty. It's a prolonged campaign with no path to victory for anyone involved. Ending something cleanly and with care is sometimes the kindest move available. Field notes. Think of a recurring tension in an important relationship, something that comes up, gets partially addressed, and then returns. Ask yourself, what would actual resolution of this look like? Not a temporary peace, a real one. What would need to be said, heard, and agreed upon? Plan to have that conversation. Brain apply in your own mind. The battlefield Sun Tzu describes in this chapter exists inside your head too, and it may be the most exhausting campaign of all. Mental prolonged conflict takes many forms. The decision you've been turning over for months without resolving. The resentment you carry about something that happened years ago, relitigating it in your mind on quiet evenings. The goal you're working toward that you haven't made real progress on in so long that it's become more of a background anxiety than an actual pursuit. Each of these is a supply line stretched far from home. They consume energy quietly, constantly, without producing anything. Psychologists sometimes call this cognitive load, the background processing cost of unresolved mental items. Sun Tzu would just call it what it is, a long campaign that's bleeding your resources. The most valuable mental habit from this chapter is what might be called active closure, the discipline of resolving open loops rather than letting them run indefinitely. This doesn't mean forcing decisions before you're ready. It means recognizing that "I'll think about it later" is often the beginning of a years-long internal campaign and asking whether you can create a real resolution now. There's also something important here about how you manage your energy across a day or a week. Sun Tzu notes that a soldier's spirit is keenest in the morning and fades as the day progresses. Your deepest work, the thinking, creating, and deciding that matters most, deserves your freshest hours, not the depleted scraps at the end of a day spent in meetings and emails. Matching your hardest work to your sharpest state is logistics thinking applied to yourself. Field notes. Write down 3 open loops in your mind right now: decisions unmade, resentments unprocessed, goals stalled. For each one, decide, can I resolve this in the next week? If yes, schedule it. If no, make a conscious decision to set it aside until a specific future date and actually put that date somewhere you'll see it. Chapter Takeaway. The measure of a campaign isn't how hard you fought, it's how efficiently you reached a resolution and how much you had left when it was over. Chapter 3. Attack by Stratagem. The greatest victory is the one that requires no fight at all. The original wisdom. If the first chapter of The Art of War is about preparation and the second is about efficiency, the third is about something far more elegant: winning without the battle ever happening. Sun Tzu opens this chapter with a statement that stops most readers in their tracks. In the practical art of war, the best thing of all is to take the enemy's country whole and intact. To shatter and destroy it is not so good. He's making a point that cuts against every instinct we have about competition and conflict. We are conditioned to think that winning means defeating, that the harder you fight and the more completely you crush your opponent, the more thoroughly you've won. Sun Tzu says that's not just wrong, it's wasteful, and often self-defeating. The supreme skill, he argues, is to subdue your opponent without fighting. To win through strategy, positioning, and intelligence rather than through force. This is not passivity, it requires more sophistication, more patience, and more genuine understanding of the situation than simply attacking does. But the outcomes are categorically better: you preserve your resources, you avoid the unpredictability of open conflict, and you often end up with something intact and usable rather than a pile of rubble you technically won. He ranks the methods of victory in order. The highest is to attack the enemy's strategy, to understand their plan and neutralize it before it unfolds. The next is to disrupt their alliances, to isolate them, to remove their support. Below that is to attack their army in the field. And the worst of all options, Sun Tzu says, is to besiege a walled city. Sieges are slow, costly, and unpredictable, the last resort of a general who has run out of better ideas. Then comes one of the most quoted lines in the entire book: if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. This isn't just a military observation. It is a complete theory of self-awareness as competitive advantage. Knowing yourself, your actual strengths, your real weaknesses, your genuine limits, is not a soft, introspective exercise. It is the hardest and most strategically important work you can do. And knowing the other party, what they want, what they fear, where they're overextended, what they're likely to do, is what separates people who navigate conflict gracefully from those who blunder through it repeatedly. The chapter ends with Sun Tzu outlining 5 qualities of the superior commander. But underneath all of it runs a single idea: think your way to victory before you fight your way there. Force is the last tool, not the first. The core principles. The best outcome in any conflict is one where the underlying problem is solved without open confrontation, intact, not destroyed. Attack the strategy, not the person. Neutralize the plan before it becomes a battle. The methods of victory rank from highest to lowest: outthink, outmaneuver, outnegotiate, then only if necessary, outfight. A direct assault on a well-defended position is almost always the worst available option. Knowing yourself clearly, strengths, weaknesses, limits, biases, is a strategic asset, not a therapy exercise. Knowing the other party, their motives, fears, constraints, and plans, is equally essential and often more actionable. The most sophisticated people in any room are usually the ones working hardest to avoid the fight they could easily win. Briefcase apply at work. Most workplace conflict follows a predictable and wasteful pattern. Someone feels wronged or blocked. Frustration builds. Eventually there's a confrontation in a meeting, over email, through a manager, that damages the relationship, produces a messy resolution, and leaves both parties slightly worse off than before. The winner, if there is one, usually pays more than they expected. Sun Tzu would look at this pattern and ask the question almost nobody asks before a workplace conflict escalates: what does the other person actually want, and is there a way to give them enough of it that the fight becomes unnecessary? This is the attack the strategy principle in practice. Before you confront a difficult colleague, understand what's driving their behavior. Before you push back on a decision, understand why it was made and what the decision maker is trying to protect. Before you escalate to HR or your manager's manager, ask whether there's a resolution available at the current level that you haven't fully explored. This is not about being a pushover. It's about being effective. The person at work who consistently resolves tension before it becomes conflict, who finds the creative solution, brokers the quiet agreement, addresses the thing before it explodes, is not the one avoiding difficulty. They're the one operating at the highest strategic level available. The know yourself principle applies here with particular sharpness. Most workplace conflicts are made worse by people who have a genuine blind spot about their own role in them. The colleague who creates tension without realizing it. The manager who micromanages because of anxiety they haven't examined. The person who always just asks questions in meetings but is actually signaling status. If you can see your own patterns clearly, especially the unflattering ones, you can change them before they create the battles that didn't need to happen. Field notes. Think of a current or recent workplace tension. Before deciding how to handle it, answer these two questions in writing. What does the other person actually want here underneath the surface position they're taking? And, what role, honestly, have I played in creating or sustaining this tension? The answers will reframe how you approach it. Office building apply in business. The businesses that win most consistently over time are rarely the ones that fight the hardest. They're the ones that make the fight irrelevant. Think about what it means to attack the enemy's strategy in a competitive market. It doesn't mean copying what competitors do. It means understanding what they're betting on and positioning yourself so that bet doesn't threaten you, or better yet, so your approach makes their entire strategy less relevant. Apple didn't beat Nokia by building a better Nokia phone. They made the entire category of phone into something different, rendering Nokia's advantages meaningless. You don't need to be Apple to apply this. A small business that serves a specific niche so well that larger competitors simply aren't relevant to its customers has attacked the strategy. A consultant who is so clearly positioned as the expert in one area that potential clients self-select without a competitive pitch process has attacked the strategy. The goal is always to create conditions where the battle either doesn't happen or is already won before it begins. The know yourself and know the enemy principle is the foundation of every good business strategy. Know yourself means having a ruthlessly honest picture of what you're actually good at, what you genuinely can't do well, and where your resources are truly sufficient versus where you're stretching. The number of businesses that fail because they pursued opportunities that didn't match their real capabilities as opposed to their hoped-for capabilities is staggering. Know the competition means something more specific than reading their website. It means understanding their constraints, what they can't do easily, what their customers complain about, where their model has inherent weaknesses. Every competitor has a walled city. The question is whether you're smart enough to avoid attacking their strengths and patient enough to find the gaps. Field notes. Map your top 2 competitors honestly. For each one, identify, what is their core strategic bet, what are they counting on? And, where are they genuinely weak, what do their customers wish were different? Then ask, am I going after their strength or their weakness? Red heart apply in relationships. The win without fighting principle is perhaps nowhere more valuable or more underused than in close relationships. Most people approach relationship conflict as an argument to be won. They build their case, wait for their turn to speak, and measure success by whether they came out ahead. Sun Tzu would recognize this immediately as the besiege the walled city approach, the most costly, least effective option available. When someone feels attacked, they defend. When they defend, they stop listening. When they stop listening, no resolution is possible, only exhaustion. Attacking the strategy in a relationship context means addressing the underlying need rather than the surface argument. Almost every recurring relationship conflict is not actually about what it appears to be about. The argument about who does more housework is often about feeling seen and valued. The fight about money is often about security, or control, or differing visions of the future. The tension about time spent together is often about feeling like a priority. If you can identify the real need underneath the surface issue in yourself and in the other person, you can often resolve the underlying thing without the bruising argument about the symptom. This requires the most demanding part of Sun Tzu's formula, knowing yourself clearly enough to identify what you actually need, not just what you're reacting to. The know yourself piece is genuinely difficult in relationships precisely because our closest relationships trigger our deepest patterns. The person who becomes immediately defensive in conflict might be protecting something they've never fully examined. The one who goes cold and silent might be managing a fear of escalation rooted somewhere far back. Seeing your own pattern clearly enough to choose a different response in the heat of the moment is one of the hardest and most valuable things a person can develop. Field notes. Take a recurring conflict in your most important relationship. Underneath the surface argument, the specific thing that gets said, the specific behavior that triggers the reaction, ask, what does each person actually need here, in the deepest sense? Write both answers. Then ask, is there a way to address those needs directly, before the argument starts? Brain apply in your own mind. The enemy you most need to defeat without fighting is often the one inside your own head. Sun Tzu's ranking of strategies, outthink, outmaneuver, negotiate, and only then fight, maps onto the relationship between your rational mind and your emotional reactions with uncomfortable precision. When a strong emotion arises, anxiety before a difficult conversation, anger at a perceived slight, shame after a mistake, your first instinct is to fight it, suppress it, or be overwhelmed by it. None of these is the highest order approach. The attack the strategy move in your own psychology is to understand the emotion before you react to it. What is the anxiety actually about? Not I'm nervous about this presentation, but what specifically am I afraid will happen, and how likely is that actually? Not I'm angry at this person, but what did I need in this situation that I didn't get, and is my anger pointing at the real source? The know yourself principle, applied internally, is about developing genuine clarity on your own patterns of thought and reaction, not to judge them, but to be less at their mercy. The person who knows they catastrophize when tired makes different decisions at 11 p.m. than the person who doesn't. The person who recognizes their tendency to people please when under social pressure can catch themselves before they agree to things they'll resent. Self-knowledge, in Sun Tzu's framing, is not a luxury. It is operational intelligence about your most important asset, yourself. Field notes. Identify one emotional pattern that consistently costs you a reaction that tends to make situations worse rather than better. Describe it specifically. What triggers it? What does it feel like in the moment? What do you typically do when it's active? Then ask, what would attacking the strategy look like addressing the underlying thing before the reaction fires? Chapter takeaway. Before you raise your voice, exhaust every option that doesn't require it, because the fight you avoid cleanly costs you nothing, while the fight you win badly can cost you everything. Chapter 4. Tactical positioning. Before you try to win, make sure you cannot lose. The original wisdom. Chapter 4 is where Sun Tzu shifts from talking about how to defeat others to talking about something far less glamorous and far more important: how to make yourself undefeatable first. The opening is almost counterintuitive in a book about war. The good fighters of old first put themselves beyond the possibility of defeat, and then waited for an opportunity to defeat the enemy. The sequence matters enormously. First, invulnerability. Then, opportunity. Not simultaneously. Not the other way around. The ancient masters of this craft secured their own positions so completely that even if the opportunity to win never came, they could not be destroyed. They waited. And when the moment arrived, they were ready. Sun Tzu draws a sharp distinction that most people never think about. Security against defeat implies defensive tactics. Ability to defeat the enemy means taking the offensive. Defense and offense are not opposites on a spectrum. They serve completely different purposes. Defense is about survival and positioning. Offense is about seizing opportunity. Confusing the two, attacking when you should be consolidating, defending when the moment calls for action, is one of the most common and costly strategic errors a person can make. He then says something that stings a little: one may know how to conquer without being able to do it. You can understand exactly what needs to happen and still be in no position to make it happen because you haven't done the foundational work of building an unassailable base first. Knowing the right move and being positioned to execute it are two completely different things. Most people spend enormous energy on the former and neglect the latter entirely. Sun Tzu introduces the concept of shi, often translated as strategic advantage or potential energy. He compares it to water held behind a dam, or a boulder perched at the top of a mountain. The energy isn't being used yet. But it's there, fully loaded, waiting. A well-positioned general doesn't need to fight hard because the position itself does most of the work. The battle is already shaped in their favor before a single move is made. The chapter closes with a reflection on measurement. Good commanders calculate carefully and precisely before committing. They know their resources, their enemy's resources, and the terrain. From this careful measurement comes the ability to act with overwhelming force at exactly the right moment rather than scrambling reactively when circumstances force a move. The whole chapter is a case for one underappreciated truth: the most important work you will ever do is the work nobody sees, the preparation, the positioning, the quiet building of foundations that makes everything else possible. The core principles. Make yourself impossible to destroy before you try to win. Security first, opportunity second. Defense and offense serve different purposes and must not be confused with each other. Understanding the right move and being positioned to execute it are two entirely different things. Strategic advantage is potential energy built quietly, held in reserve, released at the right moment. The strongest position is one where even inaction cannot hurt you. Precise measurement of your resources and honest accounting of your gaps is the foundation of real confidence. The most important work is often the least visible: the preparation, the foundations, the positioning that makes the decisive moment possible. Briefcase apply at work. There is a particular kind of professional anxiety that comes from knowing your position is fragile, where one bad quarter, one change in management, one reorg could leave you exposed. Most people respond to this anxiety by working harder within the existing situation, hoping that effort alone is enough to hold the ground. Sun Tzu would suggest something different: build the position first. What does an unassailable professional position actually look like? It's not tenure or a long title. It's a combination of things that make you genuinely difficult to remove and genuinely easy to trust with more. A track record of delivering clearly and consistently. Relationships across the organization that aren't dependent on any single manager's opinion of you. Skills that are relevant and demonstrably current. A reputation built on substance rather than politics. And crucially, options. The professional who has no alternatives to their current job is negotiating from the most vulnerable position possible. Sun Tzu's sequence: invulnerability first, then opportunity, is exactly the right order for career development. Too many people chase the next promotion, the bigger role, the visible project, before they've consolidated the foundations of where they currently are. They're trying to attack before they've secured the base. The result is often that they stretch into a bigger role without the positioning to sustain it and come back smaller than before. The concept of shi, potential energy held in reserve, has a direct professional equivalent: the reputation and capability you've built that you haven't needed to call on yet. The relationship with a senior person that you've never leveraged. The skill you've been developing quietly. The goodwill in your team from years of reliable delivery. This is stored energy. It doesn't announce itself. But when you need it, it's there, and people who haven't built it discover its absence at the worst possible moment. Field notes. Audit your professional position honestly across 4 dimensions: relationships, who in the organization genuinely vouches for you, beyond your direct manager; track record, what have you delivered that is unambiguously yours; skills, what can you do that is genuinely current and valuable; and options, what alternatives do you have if your current role disappeared tomorrow? Where are you strong? Where are you exposed? Office building apply in business. The businesses that last, that survive recessions, competitive disruptions, leadership changes, and market shifts, are not always the most aggressive or the most innovative. They are almost always the best positioned. Positioning in business is the she principle made concrete. It's the thing that means you don't have to fight every battle from scratch. A brand with genuine customer loyalty doesn't need to discount to compete, the position does the work. A company with a proprietary process or technology that competitors can't easily replicate has built the boulder on top of the mountain. A business with a strong balance sheet and low debt has options in a downturn that its leveraged competitors simply don't. Sun Tzu's distinction between defense and offense is especially critical for founders and business leaders. The mistake that kills many promising businesses is confusing a period of growth with a secure foundation, spending as if the good times are permanent, scaling before the model is truly proven, taking on obligations that leave no margin for error. Growth is offense. Resilience is defense. You need to be deliberately doing both, and you need to know which one the current moment calls for. The know how to conquer without being able to do it line is almost a direct description of the business that has the right strategy on paper but hasn't built the operational capability to execute it. The vision is clear. The market opportunity is real. But the team isn't built, the processes aren't in place, the cash runway isn't long enough. The gap between knowing the right move and being positioned to make it is where most business plans die. Before the next big push, the new market, the new product, the aggressive hiring plan, honest leaders ask, have we secured our base sufficiently to absorb a version of this going wrong? Not to talk themselves out of bold moves, but to make bold moves from a position of genuine strength rather than hopeful vulnerability. Field notes. For your current business or venture, identify your 3 most significant structural vulnerabilities, the things that, if they went wrong simultaneously, would be very difficult to survive. Then ask, what is one concrete thing I could do in the next 90 days to reduce each of those vulnerabilities? Positioning work is rarely urgent. That's exactly why it never gets done. Red Heart apply in relationships. The most secure relationships are not the ones where nothing difficult ever happens. They are the ones where the foundation is solid enough that difficult things can be survived, and sometimes, strengthened by the surviving. Sun Tzu's invulnerability first principle, applied to relationships, is about building the foundation before you need it. Trust is not a resource you can manufacture quickly when a crisis arrives. It is built slowly, through consistency, through small kept promises, through being present when it would have been easier not to be. The couple who has years of genuine repair and mutual respect behind them enters a hard season from a completely different position than the couple who has been coasting on early chemistry and never built much underneath. The she concept, potential energy held in reserve, is profoundly applicable here. Every time you listen carefully when you're tired. Every time you choose curiosity over defensiveness in a disagreement. Every time you show up for someone in a way they didn't ask for but needed, you are loading the dam. You are adding to the boulder's height. Most of this work is invisible and unremarked upon. But it accumulates. And in the moments that test a relationship, the real ones, the hard ones, it's either there or it isn't. The defense before offense principle matters in relationships too, though it sounds strange to frame it that way. Before you push for the big change, the difficult conversation, the new commitment, the challenge to an existing pattern, consider whether the foundation is strong enough to hold that weight. Not every relationship is in a place where every hard conversation can be safely had. Sometimes the right first move is to invest in the foundation, more connection, more goodwill, more genuine understanding, before you bring the weight of a hard truth to it. Field notes. Think about your most important relationship, romantic, friendship, family, or professional. Ask honestly, if something really difficult happened between us tomorrow, how strong is the foundation we'd be working from? If the honest answer is not as strong as I'd like, ask what one small, consistent thing you could start doing now to build it before it's needed. Brain apply in your own mind. The internal version of tactical positioning is one of the most undervalued ideas in personal development and one of the most practically powerful. Most people think about personal growth as accumulation, learn more, do more, achieve more. Sun Tzu's framing suggests a different question: how unassailable is your base? Before you chase the next goal, take on the next challenge, or push into the next level of anything, how secure is the foundation you're operating from? Mental and physical health are the most obvious dimensions of this. The person who is consistently sleep-deprived, nutritionally depleted, or carrying unexamined anxiety is waging every campaign from a compromised position. They might win some battles through sheer will, but they're doing it with a leaking supply line, and eventually the leak catches up. Building the base here means the unglamorous basics: sleep, movement, real food, genuine rest, and honest engagement with the psychological patterns that are costing you without your full awareness. But there is a deeper version of this principle too. Sun Tzu says the good fighter puts himself beyond the possibility of defeat before seeking victory. In psychological terms, this means developing the internal stability to pursue what matters to you without being catastrophically undone by setbacks, criticism, or failure. This is not toughness in the performative sense. It's the genuine security that comes from knowing clearly who you are, what you value, and what you're willing to stand behind, independent of external validation. The Shi principle applied to personal development is about investing in capabilities before you need them. The person who builds their financial literacy before they have significant money to manage is in a completely different position from the one who learns it in a crisis. The person who has developed genuine resilience practices, not read about them, but built them, enters a hard period from a different base than the one who hasn't. Field notes. Identify the single most significant vulnerability in your personal foundation right now, the area where, if things got harder, you would be most exposed. It might be financial, physical, relational, or psychological. Ask, what is one concrete thing I could start doing this week to strengthen this specific area? Then schedule it, rather than leaving it as an intention. Chapter takeaway. The most important investments you will ever make are the ones that mean you cannot be destroyed, because everything you build on top of that foundation stands on solid ground. Chapter 5. Energy and momentum. It's not just what you do, it's when you do it, and how you make it land. The original wisdom. Chapter 5 is where Sun Tzu gets almost poetic. After 4 chapters of careful, methodical preparation, he suddenly starts talking about something harder to pin down: the quality of force. Not just how much power you have, but how you deploy it. Not just what you do, but the way it hits. He opens with an image of a large army that can still be managed like a small one, through organization and structure. But then he moves to something more interesting: the difference between Cheng and Qi, the direct force and the indirect force. The orthodox and the unorthodox. The expected move and the surprise. In all fighting, the direct method may be used for joining battle, but indirect methods will be needed to secure victory. This is the heart of the chapter. The direct force, your main effort, your straightforward approach, is necessary. It engages the opponent, holds their attention, occupies their response. But it is almost never what actually wins. What wins is the indirect force, the unexpected angle, the creative maneuver, the move they didn't see coming because they were focused on the direct engagement. Sun Tzu says the combinations of direct and indirect force are as inexhaustible as the movements of the sun and moon, as endless as the flow of rivers. He is making the point that creativity and strategy is not a finite resource. There is always another angle. There is always an approach that hasn't been tried. The general or the person who thinks they've exhausted their options almost always hasn't. They've exhausted their obvious options. That's a very different thing. Then comes the concept that gives this chapter its real power: Shi, or strategic energy, the momentum built up by positioning and timing. Sun Tzu uses 2 images that are worth sitting with. The first is a boulder released from a mountain height. The energy isn't in the pushing, it's in the setup. The second is a hawk striking its prey. The timing is so precise that the strike breaks the spine before the prey can react. The onset of troops is like the rush of a torrent which will even roll stones along in its course. What he's describing is the difference between force that is manufactured in the moment, through effort, willpower, and direct application, and force that has been building and is now released at exactly the right instant. The latter is categorically more powerful. And it requires 2 things that most people undervalue: patience in the building, and decisiveness in the release. The chapter ends with a note on how great commanders seek victory from the situation itself rather than demanding it from individual people. They find soldiers suited to the moment and create the conditions where the right energy is inevitable. The skill is in the setup, not the struggle. The core principles. Direct force engages, indirect force wins. You need both, in the right sequence. The combinations of approach are inexhaustible. When obvious options are exhausted, unconventional ones remain. Strategic energy is potential force released at precisely the right moment. It multiplies effort rather than replacing it. Timing transforms the same action from ordinary to devastating. The identical move lands completely differently depending on when it arrives. The most powerful force is not manufactured in the moment but built through positioning and released through patience. Create conditions where the right outcome becomes almost inevitable rather than forcing outcomes through sheer effort. Decisiveness at the moment of release is just as important as patience in the building. Briefcase apply at work. Most people at work operate almost entirely in direct force mode. They work harder, stay later, produce more, push louder. And up to a point, this works. Direct force is necessary. It shows up, it delivers, it holds the ground. But very few careers are built on direct force alone, and the ones that seem to be have usually had a few critical indirect moves underneath the surface that made the difference. The indirect force in a career context is the unexpected angle, the move that reframes the situation rather than fighting within it. The person who, instead of competing for the same promotion as 3 colleagues, identifies a gap nobody is addressing and builds their reputation there. The employee who solves a problem their manager didn't know they had, rather than simply executing the tasks they were given. The professional who builds a relationship across the organization quietly, genuinely, without agenda, and finds years later that it opens a door that direct effort alone never would have. Timing is everything here, and it's one of the most underappreciated career skills. The same idea, pitched at the wrong moment, gets dismissed. Pitched when the organization is ready for it, when the problem it solves has just become urgent, when the decision maker is in the right frame of mind, when the conditions have shifted in its favor, it lands like the hawk strike. People who develop a feel for organizational timing, who understand the rhythms of how decisions get made, when people are receptive versus defensive, when the ground is moving versus settled, operate with a kind of leverage that raw talent alone can't match. The boulder on the mountain image applies directly to professional momentum. The person who has been quietly delivering, building relationships, and developing skills for 2 years has stored energy that the person who just arrived, however talented, hasn't. When the moment comes, the release of that stored momentum looks effortless to observers. It is not effortless. It was built. The invisibility of the building is part of why people misread professional success as luck or personality rather than accumulated strategic energy. Field notes. Identify one goal you're currently pursuing at work primarily through direct force, harder effort, more volume, more visible activity. Then ask, what is the indirect move here, the unexpected angle, the creative reframe, the relationship or positioning play that could achieve the same outcome with more leverage? Write down 2 options you haven't tried. Office building apply in business. The most successful companies in the world are not usually the ones that fought the hardest in direct competition. They're the ones that found the indirect angle, the move that made the direct competition irrelevant or reshaped the terrain entirely. Netflix didn't beat Blockbuster by opening better video stores. They made the store format itself obsolete. Airbnb didn't beat hotels by building better hotels. They found a completely different supply of accommodation that existing players couldn't easily replicate. In both cases, the direct force, engaging the existing market on its own terms, was present, but the indirect force, the genuinely new angle, was what made the difference. This is not only available to billion-dollar companies. A small business that finds the indirect approach, the underserved customer segment, the unconventional channel, the service model competitors haven't thought to copy, can achieve the same principle at a fraction of the scale. The question is always, where is everyone else applying direct force, and where is there a different angle they haven't taken? Timing in business strategy deserves its own attention. The same product launched 2 years too early becomes a cautionary tale about markets that weren't ready. Launched at the right moment, when the customer problem has become acute, when the enabling technology has matured, when the cultural conditions have shifted, it looks like genius. The difference between the two is often not the quality of the idea but the timing of its release. The create conditions rather than force outcomes principle is what separates great marketing from desperate marketing. Desperate marketing tries to push people toward a decision through volume and pressure, more ads, more emails, more urgency manufactured from nothing. Great marketing creates the conditions where the decision feels natural, even inevitable, because the customer's problem has been understood so precisely, and the solution positioned so clearly, that choosing it feels like their own idea rather than something sold to them. Field notes. Look at your main product, service, or offering. Ask, where's the direct competition, the area where everyone is fighting on the same terms? Then ask, what is one genuinely indirect approach, a different audience, a different channel, a different framing that would encounter far less resistance? Give yourself 20 minutes to think laterally before returning to the obvious answers. Red Heart apply in relationships. The direct force approach in relationships is the one most people default to. Say what you want, push for what you need, make the argument directly. And sometimes this is exactly right. Clarity and directness are genuine virtues in close relationships. But there are many situations where the indirect approach is not only more elegant but more effective. The partner who wants more quality time together and asks for it directly and gets defensive resistance might find that creating a specific, easy, enjoyable ritual together achieves the same outcome without the friction. The parent who wants to open a conversation with a teenager about something difficult will almost certainly have more success in the car, side by side, doing something together, than sitting across from them at a kitchen table for a formal talk. Same goal. Completely different angle. Completely different result. The timing principle in relationships is one that people who are good at relationships understand intuitively and people who aren't tend to violate repeatedly. Bringing up a serious issue when your partner is exhausted, stressed, or emotionally activated is the direct force equivalent of attacking a fortified position. The content of what you're saying might be completely valid, but the timing means the message can't land. The same conversation, at the right moment, when both people are calm, connected, and have capacity, has a completely different energy and a vastly higher chance of going somewhere useful. The SHE concept, accumulated energy released at the right moment, describes what happens in the best long-term relationships. Years of genuine care, of being present, of small reliable kindnesses build up a reservoir that changes how hard moments land. A difficult conversation between people who have genuinely invested in each other starts from a different place than the same conversation between people who haven't. The stored energy of the relationship is doing invisible work in the background. Field notes. Think of something you want to shift or improve in an important relationship, something you've raised directly before without much progress. Ask, what is the indirect approach here, the way of creating the conditions for this to change, rather than pushing for the change itself? And, when is the right moment for this, what state do both of us need to be in for this to have a real chance? Brain apply in your own mind. The most exhausting way to live is to manufacture all your momentum from direct effort, to push yourself through everything through willpower alone, with no stored energy and no strategic timing. Most people know this feeling. The project you're forcing. The habit you're trying to maintain through grindstone discipline with no natural momentum behind it. The goal you've committed to publicly but that feels like dragging a boulder uphill every single day. This is direct force without SHE effort, without accumulated energy, and it works until it doesn't, which is usually at the worst possible moment. The indirect approach in your own psychology is about creating conditions where the behavior you want becomes easier rather than forcing it through resistance. You don't build a reading habit by lecturing yourself about the importance of reading. You build it by putting the book on your pillow every morning, by removing the phone from the bedroom, by creating the environmental conditions where reading is the path of least resistance. The indirect force, the setup, does the work that willpower alone can't sustain. Timing in personal decision-making is as critical as it is in military strategy. The decision made in a low state, tired, hungry, emotionally flooded, or in the middle of a fear response is almost always worse than the same decision made from a resourced state. Developing awareness of your own energy cycles, when you are sharp, when you are depleted, when you are emotionally flooded, and deliberately timing important decisions and difficult conversations to your peak states is one of the highest leverage personal practices available. It is not always possible, but it is possible more often than most people act on. The bolder image is worth returning to for anyone in a long building phase, the slow accumulation before the breakthrough. It doesn't feel like momentum while it's happening. It feels like repetition, uncertainty, and the nagging question of whether any of this is going anywhere. But the energy is real. It is accumulating. And when the moment comes, when the conditions align and the release happens, the force of it will surprise even you. Field notes. Identify one goal or habit you're currently maintaining through willpower and direct effort alone. Ask, what environmental or structural change would make this easier? What indirect setup would reduce the effort required? Then ask, am I making key decisions about this in my best states, or in my worst ones? Adjust accordingly. Chapter takeaway. The most powerful move is rarely the most obvious one, it's the right angle, at the right moment, released from a foundation that was built when nobody was watching. Chapter 6. Weak points and strong. Don't fight where they're ready for you. Strike where they aren't. The original wisdom. If Chapter 5 was about the quality and timing of force, Chapter 6 is about its direction. And Sun Tzu's instruction here is almost disarmingly simple: go where they are not. He opens with a principle that cuts against every instinct of the direct competitor. Whoever is first in the field and awaits the coming of the enemy will be fresh for the fight. Whoever is second in the field and has to hasten to battle will arrive exhausted. The advantage doesn't belong automatically to the larger force or the more experienced fighter. It belongs to whoever controls where and when the engagement happens. If you can choose the ground, and your opponent has to come to you on your terms, you have already won a significant portion of the battle before it begins. From there, Sun Tzu develops what might be the most tactically precise section of the entire book. You can be sure of succeeding in your attacks if you only attack places which are undefended. This sounds obvious. It is almost never practiced. Most people, in competition, in negotiation, in conflict, attack exactly where the other party is most prepared and most defended, simply because that's where the obvious confrontation exists. The defended position is visible. The undefended one requires looking harder. He introduces the idea of making the opponent come to you by creating something they value, threatening something they can't afford to lose, or simply being somewhere they have to respond to. If I wish to take the offensive, I have only to attack some place which he will be constrained to relieve. Control is not about brute force. It's about dictating the terms of engagement, choosing the ground, the moment, and the point of contact. Then comes the water metaphor that is one of the most quoted passages in the entire book. Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe he is facing. Rigidity loses. Adaptability wins. The approach that worked perfectly against one opponent, in one set of conditions, may be completely wrong against a different opponent in different conditions. The general who applies the same strategy regardless of what they're facing is not being consistent, they're being inflexible, and inflexibility is a weakness. Sun Tzu closes with a note that has unsettled military strategists and business thinkers for centuries. Military tactics are like unto water, for water in its natural course runs away from high places and hastens downwards. So in war, the way is to avoid what is strong and to strike at what is weak. Not just sometimes. Always. The path to victory runs through the gaps, not through the walls. The core principles. Arrive first and set the terms. Whoever controls the ground controls the engagement. Attack what is undefended, not what is fortified. The obvious confrontation is usually the wrong one. Make opponents come to you by threatening what they cannot afford to lose. Strength and weakness are not fixed, they shift constantly with conditions, and you must read them in real time. Adaptability is not inconsistency, it is the highest form of strategic intelligence. Your approach must be shaped by the specific opponent and conditions you face, not by habit or preference. The path to victory always runs through the gaps, find them before you move. Briefcase apply at work. Every workplace has a map of strong points and weak points, defended territory and open ground, and the people who navigate careers most effectively learn to read it accurately. The strong points are the areas that are already claimed, already contested, already crowded with capable people competing on the same terms. The obvious promotion track. The high visibility project that everyone wants a piece of. The skill set that everyone in your field is currently rushing to develop. Competing here is not impossible, but it is exhausting. You are attacking fortified positions, and even victories are costly. The weak points, the open ground, are almost always less obvious and less glamorous, at least initially. The problem nobody has claimed ownership of yet. The unglamorous but genuinely important function that capable people avoid because it isn't shiny enough. The gap between two teams that creates friction nobody is solving. The skill that is about to become critical but hasn't been recognized as such yet. These are the undefended places. The person who moves there first, and does the work well, finds that the ground becomes theirs with far less resistance than the crowded path would have required. The make them come to you principle as a direct professional application becomes so clearly valuable in a specific, well-defined area that opportunities are drawn to you rather than requiring you to chase them. This is positioning as gravity. The specialist who is genuinely the best available at one specific thing, not moderately good at many things, creates a form of professional leverage that generalists rarely achieve. When the specific problem arises, there is only one name that comes to mind. That is the undefended position made powerful. Reading your own weak points with the same honesty is equally essential. The colleague who exploits a gap in your knowledge. The situation where your communication style consistently creates friction. The type of work that reliably reveals your limits. Knowing these clearly, without defensiveness, means you can either address them deliberately or simply avoid putting yourself in positions where they become decisive. Most people know their weaknesses vaguely. Sun Tzu is asking for precision. Field notes. Draw a simple map of your professional landscape. Mark the strong points, the crowded, contested areas where competition is fierce. Then mark the weak points, the gaps, the unclaimed territory, the problems nobody owns. Ask honestly, where am I spending most of my energy? And, where's the open ground that I'm walking past every day? Office building apply in business. The most reliable path to business success is not to be better than your competitors at what they're already doing well. It is to find the place where they are genuinely weak structurally, not temporarily, and to build something there that they cannot easily copy. Every dominant business has weak points. They are almost always a function of their strengths. The large company that is very good at serving enterprise clients is almost always structurally poor at serving small ones. The economics don't work, the processes are too heavy, the culture doesn't value the relationship. The premium brand that has built its reputation on exclusivity cannot easily serve the mass market without damaging what it has. The business built on low price cannot easily compete on quality. These are not failures of effort or intelligence. They are structural consequences of strategic choices, and they create open ground for anyone paying attention. Sun Tzu's water metaphor is almost a complete theory of competitive strategy in one sentence. Water doesn't try to flow uphill. It finds the lowest point, the gap, the path of least resistance, and it moves there with tremendous force once it finds it. The question every business should be asking regularly is not how do we beat the competition, which almost always leads to fighting on their terms, in their strong territory, but where are they not flowing, and why? The make them come to you principle applied to marketing and sales is about owning a problem so completely that your ideal customer self-selects. When someone has the exact problem you solve and they search for solutions, does your name come up first? When someone in your industry needs the specific thing you offer, are you the obvious answer? If not, you are still in the position of having to go and find customers rather than having customers come and find you. The shift from the former to the latter is one of the most valuable a business can make. Knowing your own business's weak points is not just risk management. It is competitive intelligence about yourself. The areas where your product is genuinely inferior. The customer complaints that keep recurring. The parts of your operation that are held together by the heroic effort of specific people rather than robust systems. These are the places a smart competitor will attack. Knowing them before they do gives you the chance to address them, or at least to not be surprised when the attack comes. Field notes. Choose your most significant competitor. Spend 30 minutes genuinely looking for their structural weak points, not their bad days, but the places where their business model, culture, or strategic choices create permanent gaps. Then ask, am I building anything in those gaps, or am I still fighting them on their strongest ground? Red Heart apply in relationships. The weak points and strong points framework sounds coldly tactical for relationships, and it would be, if applied with the wrong intention. But read with care, it contains some of the most practically useful relationship wisdom in the entire book. Every person has strong points and weak points in how they receive connection, communication, and care. The strong points are the ways of engaging that feel natural and easy, the communication style they respond to well, the kind of support that actually lands for them, the conditions under which they are at their most open and receptive. The weak points are not flaws to exploit, they are the tender spots, the areas of insecurity or past hurt, the conditions under which they become defended and closed. Understanding both, in the people you're closest to, and in yourself, is not manipulation. It is the kind of genuine knowledge that allows you to show up for someone effectively rather than generically. The partner who knows that their person receives love most clearly through acts of service rather than words of affirmation isn't playing a game. They're being a student of the specific human in front of them, which is exactly what Sun Tzu is asking for. The friend who knows that a particular person becomes defensive when approached directly about something difficult, and finds an indirect moment instead, is not being calculating. They're being wise. The water metaphor has a deeply human application in conflict. Rigidity in how you engage, always the same approach, the same tone, the same framing, regardless of the person or the moment, is not a virtue. It is an inability to adapt. The person who has one mode, always direct, or always avoidant, or always self-deprecating, or always intense, is applying the same tactics to every terrain and wondering why results vary. The highest relational intelligence is the ability to read what this specific moment, with this specific person, actually calls for, and to respond to that, rather than to your default. Field notes. Think about someone important in your life with whom communication sometimes breaks down. Ask, when are they most open and receptive? What conditions bring out their best ability to hear and connect? And, what are the conditions that cause them to close down or become defended? Now ask the same questions about yourself in that relationship. The map you draw will tell you more than any conversation about communication styles ever has. Brain apply in your own mind. The most important map of weak points and strong points you will ever draw is of yourself, and most people never draw it with real honesty. Your strong points, in Sun Tzu's terms, are not just your skills. They are the conditions under which you operate at your best, the type of problem that energizes you, the environment that brings out your clearest thinking, the kind of pressure that sharpens rather than overwhelms you. Most people have a vague sense of these. The people who perform consistently at high levels have a precise one. They know what they need to do their best work, and they create those conditions deliberately, rather than hoping they'll arise accidentally. Your weak points are equally worth mapping with precision. Not as a list of inadequacies to feel bad about, but as operational intelligence. The type of situation that consistently produces your worst decisions. The emotional state that reliably compromises your judgment. The kind of person or dynamic that tends to bring out the least useful version of you. The work environment that depletes rather than energizes. These are your undefended positions, the places a difficult situation will find you unprepared if you haven't thought about them in advance. Sun Tzu's water principle applied to personal growth is genuinely liberating if you let it be. Water does not try to flow uphill. It finds the path where its nature is an asset rather than a liability. This is not an argument for avoiding all difficulty or never developing weak areas. It is an argument for the strategic intelligence of knowing where your effort yields a 10 times return and where it yields almost nothing, and allocating accordingly. The person who spends their career trying to shore up fundamental weaknesses, at the cost of developing genuine strengths, is fighting uphill against their own nature. The person who builds their life around their genuine strong points, and manages around their weak ones rather than pretending they don't exist, is flowing downhill. Field notes. Create a simple, honest inventory. Under strong points, list not just skills but the specific conditions, problem types, and environments where you genuinely excel. Under weak points, list not character flaws but the specific situations, states, and dynamics where you consistently underperform. Then look at how you're currently spending your time and energy. How much is in territory where you're strong? How much is on ground where you're reliably weak? Chapter takeaway. Stop attacking the walls. Find the gate that's already open, because the most efficient path to where you want to go is almost never the most obvious one. Chapter 7. Manoeuvring. The obstacle is not in your way. It is the way if you're willing to think differently about it. The original wisdom. Chapter 7 opens with a problem that every strategist, every leader, and every person trying to get somewhere meaningful will recognize immediately: the most direct path is rarely the one that actually gets you there. Sun Tzu begins with the challenge of maneuvering, the art of moving your forces into the most advantageous position before the decisive moment. And he is honest about how hard this is. Nothing is more difficult than the tactical maneuvers. The difficulty of tactical maneuvering consists in turning the devious into the direct, and the apparently disadvantageous into the advantageous. Read that again. The skill is not finding the direct path and following it. The skill is taking what appears to be a roundabout, indirect, even disadvantageous route and turning it into your most direct line to victory. This is a complete inversion of how most people think about progress. We are conditioned to equate directness with efficiency, and obstacles with problems to be removed. Sun Tzu is saying something more sophisticated. Sometimes the detour is the shortcut, and the obstacle is the most important part of the journey. He illustrates this with a military example. A general who sends troops racing ahead to seize an advantage, without accounting for the pace of the march, the state of the supply lines, or the condition of the soldiers, arrives at the destination with a depleted, exhausted force that cannot capitalize on the position they've just reached. Speed without coordination is not an advantage. It is a new problem wearing the costume of progress. Sun Tzu then turns to something that sounds almost mystical but is actually profoundly practical: the management of energy across a force. He talks about the difference between morning spirit, sharp, fresh, full of intention, and the spirit of late afternoon, which has grown heavy and dull. A clever general avoids an army when its spirit is keen, but attacks it when it is sluggish and inclined to return. Don't engage a force at its peak. Wait for the dip. This applies not just to armies but to negotiations, to difficult conversations, to competitive timing, to your own daily schedule. He also introduces the principle of using local knowledge, knowing the terrain, the roads, the geography, as a non-negotiable requirement for effective maneuvering. You cannot adapt to ground you haven't studied. You cannot turn an obstacle into an advantage if you don't understand what kind of obstacle it is. The chapter closes with a series of tactical principles about when to engage and when to hold, when to advance and when to give way, all pointing toward the same underlying wisdom: rigidity kills. The general who responds to every situation with the same move is not disciplined. They are brittle. And brittle things break under pressure. The core principles. The path that appears indirect or disadvantageous is often the most direct route to the real objective. Speed without coordination is not progress, it is a new problem created by impatience. Energy management across a campaign matters as much as the tactics of any individual engagement. Engage opponents at their low points, not their peaks, timing your moves around their energy, not just your own readiness. Local knowledge, understanding the specific terrain you're operating on, is a prerequisite for effective adaptation. Rigidity is a form of brittleness. The ability to change approach without losing direction is one of the highest strategic skills. Turning obstacles into advantages is not optimism. It is a learnable discipline that requires honest, precise thinking about what the obstacle actually is. Briefcase apply at work. Every career has a stretch that doesn't look like progress from the inside. The sideways move that felt like a demotion but turned out to be the development experience that made everything else possible. The difficult manager who was genuinely unpleasant to work for but whose standards permanently raised your baseline. The project that felt like a punishment assignment but put you in front of people and problems you never would have encountered on the obvious path. These are Sun Tzu's devious routes turned direct. They don't feel like shortcuts while you're in them. They feel like detours. The difference between the person who extracts full value from them and the person who simply endures them is the ability to ask, at the beginning of the apparent obstacle, what is actually available here, if I approach this as an opportunity rather than an inconvenience? The energy management principle from this chapter has a precise professional application that almost nobody talks about explicitly: the timing of difficult conversations and high-stakes requests. The colleague who brings a contentious proposal to a team meeting on a Friday afternoon, when everyone is depleted and resistant, is fighting against the energy of the room. The same proposal, brought on a Tuesday morning after a win, when the team's spirit is high and the atmosphere is constructive, lands in completely different conditions. The content hasn't changed. The timing has changed everything. Sun Tzu's note about racing ahead without coordinating the supply lines is a direct description of what happens when ambitious people take on more than their current infrastructure can support. The promotion sought before the skills are consolidated. The team expanded before the culture is strong enough to absorb new people. The scope extended before the core is truly delivered. In each case, you arrive at the destination depleted with the position but not the capacity to use it. Coordination between ambition and capability, between speed and sustainability, is not caution. It is what makes the advance stick. Field notes. Identify one obstacle or apparent setback in your professional life right now, something that feels like it is slowing you down or taking you off course. Ask honestly, what is actually available in this situation that wouldn't be available on the straightforward path? Write down at least 2 things this obstacle is giving you: access to relationships, knowledge, resilience, perspective that the easy route wouldn't have provided. Office building apply in business. The history of business is full of companies that turn what appeared to be devastating obstacles into the foundations of their greatest advantages, and equally full of companies that hit the same obstacles and simply broke. The obstacle that forces a business to find a cheaper way to operate can become a permanent cost advantage over competitors who never faced the same pressure. The market rejection that forces a pivot can reveal a customer need that turns out to be far larger than the original idea. The key person who leaves and forces the founder to rebuild can create a more robust, less dependent organization than the one that existed before. None of this is guaranteed. The difference between the obstacle that breaks a business and the one that transforms it is almost always the quality of thinking brought to it, specifically, whether the leadership team is asking, how do we get back to where we were, or what does this make possible that wasn't possible before? The coordination principle, don't race ahead of your supply lines, is one of the most reliably violated rules in fast-growing businesses. Growth is intoxicating. When things are working, the instinct is to accelerate everything simultaneously: hire faster, expand to new markets, launch new products, raise more money and deploy it quickly. Sun Tzu would recognize this immediately: troops racing ahead of their logistics. The business arrives at the new position bigger, more complex, more exposed, before the systems, culture, and capabilities needed to operate at that scale have caught up. The resulting chaos is not bad luck. It is the predictable consequence of speed without coordination. Local knowledge, understanding the specific terrain, is what separates market entry done well from market entry done expensively. The company that enters a new geography or customer segment by genuinely learning its specific dynamics first, the regulatory environment, the cultural preferences, the existing alternatives, the real distribution channels, maneuvers effectively. The company that assumes the new terrain works like the terrain it already knows usually discovers the differences in the most costly way possible. Field notes. Name one significant challenge or setback your business is currently facing or has recently faced. Instead of framing it as a problem to solve, frame it as a terrain feature to maneuver around. Ask, what does this obstacle make possible? What advantage, clarity, or capability could come from engaging with it well rather than simply trying to remove it? Red Heart apply in relationships. The most important maneuvering in relationships is not around other people. It is around your own fixed ideas about how things are supposed to go. We enter our closest relationships with a set of expectations, often unexamined and unstated, about how connection should look, how conflict should resolve, how love should be expressed and received. When reality diverges from these expectations, as it always does, the rigid response is to experience the divergence as failure or threat. The maneuvering response is to treat it as terrain, as information about the specific person and relationship in front of you, which may require a completely different approach than the one you brought in. The devious route turned direct principle has a profound application in long-term relationships. The period of difficulty, the season when a relationship is genuinely hard, when both people have to work at it in ways that feel unnatural and tiring, is often not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is frequently the terrain through which the relationship has to travel in order to reach a deeper and more durable form of connection. Couples who have been through a serious difficulty and navigated it well often describe it as the thing that made their relationship real. The obstacle was the path, not a detour from it. The energy management principle applies with particular sharpness to family dynamics and long-term partnerships. Trying to engage a deeply tired partner in a serious conversation about the relationship is the relational equivalent of attacking a fresh army at dawn, except it's your own ally you're depleting. The principle isn't to avoid important conversations indefinitely. It is to respect the energy states of the people you're trying to connect with, and to choose moments where real engagement is actually possible rather than moments that are merely convenient for you. Field notes. Think of a difficulty or period of friction in an important relationship, past or present. Ask, what did navigating this difficulty actually produce? What understanding, depth, or capability exists in this relationship now that wouldn't have developed without that hard stretch? If you're in the middle of the difficulty right now, ask the forward version, what might this be making possible if we navigate it well? Brain apply in your own mind. The internal version of maneuvering is one of the most important and least taught life skills available, the ability to work with your circumstances rather than against them, to find the route through rather than the route around. Most people's relationship with obstacles is binary, either the obstacle gets removed, or the goal gets abandoned. Sun Tzu is pointing at a third option that is almost always available and almost always overlooked: the obstacle gets used. The constraint becomes the creative brief. The setback becomes the data. The loss becomes the recalibration. This is not toxic positivity, the insistence that everything is fine and every difficulty is a blessing in disguise. It is something sharper and more demanding, the discipline of asking what is actually here, and what can be done with it, before defaulting to either denial or despair. The person who loses a job and asks that question with real seriousness often discovers that the clarity forced by the loss reveals something important about what they actually want, which the security of the previous position had made it too comfortable to examine. The energy management principle is perhaps nowhere more important than in the internal domain. Your cognitive and emotional resources are finite, they deplete under stress faster than you think, and they replenish more slowly than you wish. The person who tries to do their most demanding thinking, the hard decisions, the difficult creative work, the important reflections, in their depleted states is maneuvering without having assessed the condition of their troops. Building an honest awareness of your own energy cycles, and routing your most important work through your best states, is not laziness. It is the most effective use of the most important resource you have. Field notes. Identify the most significant obstacle you are currently facing in your personal life. Write it at the top of a page. Then spend 10 minutes writing everything this obstacle might be making possible, new directions it forces you to consider, capabilities it requires you to develop, clarity it provides about what actually matters. Don't filter for likelihood. Just generate. The quality of your thinking about obstacles is one of the most reliable predictors of your outcomes. Chapter takeaway. The person who can look at what is blocking them and ask, what does this make possible? Instead of only, how do I remove this? will consistently find paths that the rigid thinker never sees. Chapter 8. Variation of Tactics. The rules that saved you yesterday may be exactly what destroys you tomorrow. The Original Wisdom. Chapter 8 is one of the shortest in the art of war and one of the most unsettling. Because what Sun Tzu is really saying here, underneath the military language, is that the thing most people rely on most heavily, their established approach, their proven methods, their hard-won rules, can become the very source of their defeat if applied without judgment. He opens with a list of tactical principles. There are roads not to follow, armies not to attack, towns not to besiege, positions not to contest, commands from the sovereign not to obey. This last one is the most startling. A commander in the field, Sun Tzu says, must be willing to override orders from above if the ground reality makes those orders wrong. The general who blindly follows instructions that don't fit the actual terrain is not being loyal. They are being dangerous. The underlying principle is radical. No rule is absolute. Every tactical principle, every piece of received wisdom, every best practice, every rule of thumb was derived from a specific set of conditions. When those conditions change, the rule must change with them. The general who cannot do this, Sun Tzu says, may understand the value of tactical variations in theory but cannot use them in practice. Knowing the rule is not the same as knowing when to break it. He then identifies 5 dangerous character flaws in a commander, and this section is worth reading slowly, because these are not abstract military vices. They are recognizable human patterns that show up in offices, relationships, and internal monologues every single day. The first is recklessness, the leader who will fight any battle, take any risk, without calculating the cost. The second is cowardice, the one so afraid of loss that they cannot act when action is required. The third is a quick temper, the one who can be provoked into abandoning their strategy by insult or provocation. The fourth is excessive honor, the ones so concerned with their reputation that they make decisions to protect their image rather than to achieve their objective. And the fifth is excessive compassion, the ones so focused on avoiding any harm to those they care for that they cannot make the hard calls that the situation demands. Each of these flaws, Sun Tzu notes, leads to ruin in a specific and predictable way. They are not random weaknesses. They are structural vulnerabilities, and a smart opponent who identifies them will exploit them deliberately and reliably. The chapter ends with a note that ties the whole thing together: the general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country and do good service for his sovereign, is the jewel of the kingdom. The person who can act correctly, advancing or retreating as the situation demands, free from the ego distortions that make correct action so difficult, is the rarest and most valuable kind of leader. The core principles. No rule is absolute. Every principle was derived from specific conditions and must be adapted when those conditions change. The ability to vary tactics in theory is worthless without the ability to do it in practice, under pressure, in real time. There are situations, positions, and battles that should simply be refused. Knowing what not to engage is as important as knowing how to engage. 5 character flaws: recklessness, cowardice, quick temper, excessive concern for reputation, and excessive compassion create predictable and exploitable vulnerabilities. A smart opponent will probe for your character weaknesses and use them against you deliberately. The ability to advance without ego and retreat without shame is among the rarest and most powerful qualities a person can develop. Rigid adherence to any system, however good, eventually produces the conditions for that system's failure. Briefcase apply at work. Every experienced professional has a set of rules they live by, approaches that have worked before, principles derived from hard experience, methods that have been validated enough times to feel like reliable truth. This is not a problem. Pattern recognition built from experience is genuinely valuable, and the person who has none is operating blind. The problem arrives when those rules calcify. When they stop being tools and become identity. When "this is how I work" becomes indistinguishable from "this is who I am," and any challenge to the approach feels like a personal attack rather than useful information. Sun Tzu's point is not that experience is worthless. It's that every rule of thumb was derived from a particular context, and when the context changes, the rule must be re-examined. The manager whose leadership style was forged in a fast-paced startup environment and who applies it unchanged to a large, complex organization is following a road that should not be followed. The sales professional whose approach was built in an era of relationship-led selling and who hasn't adapted to a market where buyers research extensively before first contact is attacking an army that isn't there anymore. The 5 character flaws are worth examining with uncomfortable honesty in a professional context. Recklessness shows up as the person who is always pushing for the bold move, the aggressive bet, the dramatic action, not because the situation calls for it but because caution feels like weakness to them. Cowardice shows up as the endless deferral, the decision that keeps getting kicked, the meeting that ends without a resolution because nobody wants to own the call. Quick temper shows up in the professional who can be reliably baited into an emotional response, the one whose colleagues and adversaries have learned that a well-placed provocation will derail their judgment every time. Excessive concern for reputation is perhaps the most common professional flaw of all and the most socially acceptable, which makes it harder to see. It shows up as the person who won't take on a project that might fail publicly, who manages their image in meetings rather than contributing honestly, who avoids the difficult conversation because being seen as difficult costs more to them than the problem the conversation would solve. The work suffers. The team suffers. But the reputation stays intact, at least for a while. Field notes. Of Sun Tzu's 5 character flaws, which one do you recognize most clearly in yourself, not in your worst moments, but as a recurring pattern? Be specific about how it shows up in your professional life. Then ask, has anyone ever exploited this pattern in me, used it to get a reaction or outcome that served them rather than me? The honest answer to that question is the most useful information you can have about where your judgment is most vulnerable. Office building apply in business. The graveyard of once great businesses is largely populated by companies that found something that worked, a model, a product, a formula, and then defended it past the point where the conditions that made it work had changed. Blockbuster's model worked perfectly until streaming made physical rental obsolete. Kodak's model worked perfectly until digital made film obsolete. Nokia's model worked perfectly until the smartphone made their definition of phone obsolete. In each case, the company's deep expertise in the existing approach became a liability rather than an asset because that expertise was inseparable from a belief that the existing approach was still the right one. This is Sun Tzu's central warning in Chapter 8 applied to business at its most consequential scale. The tactics that produced victory in one set of conditions will produce defeat when conditions change, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, and then suddenly. The business that is still optimizing the old model while the terrain shifts beneath it is following a road that should not be followed. The variation of tactics principle demands that businesses build genuine adaptability into their operating model, not just the stated willingness to adapt, which most companies have in abundance on their strategy slides, but the structural capacity to actually do it. This means regularly examining whether the rules being followed still fit the conditions they were derived from. It means creating genuine space for people to say this approach isn't working anymore without that being received as disloyalty or defeatism. And it means having leadership with the ego strength to retreat without shame when retreat is the correct move, to discontinue a product, exit a market, or abandon a strategy that is no longer serving the objective. The excessive compassion flaw deserves specific attention in a business context, because it is systematically under-acknowledged. The leader who cannot make the hard call, who cannot exit the underperforming product, restructure the team, end the partnership that isn't working out of care for the people and relationships involved, is causing more harm through inaction than the difficult decision would have caused. Compassion is a genuine virtue. Compassion that prevents necessary action is a structural vulnerability, and Sun Tzu is clear that it leads to predictable ruin. Field notes. Identify one rule, practice, or approach in your business that was established in different conditions than currently exist, something that made complete sense when it was created but that you haven't re-examined since. Ask, do the conditions that justified this still hold? And, if we were designing this from scratch today, knowing what we know now, would we make the same choice? Red Heart apply in relationships. The rules we carry into relationships about how love should work, how conflict should be handled, how much space is normal, what loyalty requires, are almost always inherited rather than chosen. They come from the families we grew up in, the relationships we've had before, the cultural stories we absorbed about what a good relationship looks like. And for a while, especially early in a relationship, we don't examine them. We just apply them. The problem Sun Tzu would identify is not that these inherited rules exist. It's that they tend to be applied uniformly to every person, every dynamic, every stage of the relationship, regardless of whether the conditions actually fit. The person who learned, in a chaotic household, that the way to handle conflict is to withdraw and wait for the storm to pass brings that rule to every relationship. It may have been genuinely adaptive in the original context. Applied universally, without examination, it becomes a source of recurring disconnection. Variation of tactics in relationships means developing the flexibility to respond to the specific person and moment in front of you, rather than running your standard program. The partner who is struggling needs something different from the partner who is thriving. The stage of a relationship where trust is being built calls for different behavior than the stage where it has been established for years. The conflict about something genuinely important requires a different quality of engagement than the friction about something trivial. Applying the same approach to all of these is not consistency. It is the kind of rigidity that erodes intimacy slowly and almost invisibly. The 5 character flaws have direct relationship equivalents that are worth sitting with. The quick temper in relationships is the person who can be reliably triggered, whose partner, family member, or friend has learned, consciously or not, that a certain word or tone will produce a predictable explosion. This predictability is not just unpleasant. It is a vulnerability that shapes the entire dynamic, as the people around them learn to manage rather than engage authentically. Excessive concern for reputation shows up as the partner who is more focused on appearing reasonable in a conflict than on actually resolving it, who performs the right moves without the genuine intention behind them. Field notes. Identify one rule you carry about how relationships should work, something you apply consistently across your important relationships. Where did it come from? Does it actually fit the specific relationship you're applying it to right now? And is there any evidence that it's creating friction or distance that a different approach might not? Brain apply in your own mind. The most dangerous rigid rules are the ones about yourself. I'm not a morning person. I'm bad at confrontation. I don't have a head for numbers. I need external pressure to get things done. I'm an introvert, large groups drain me completely. Some of these may be genuinely true, stable features of your nature. But many of them are rules derived from limited evidence, often a few formative experiences, that have calcified into identity before they've been properly tested. Sun Tzu's insistence on variation of tactics, applied internally, is an invitation to examine which of your self-rules are genuinely descriptive and which are simply habitual. The person who decided at 22 that they were not creative based on one art class and a dismissive teacher has been following a road that perhaps should not be followed. The person who has always been bad at difficult conversations and has therefore avoided them for decades has simply never developed the capability that avoidance has prevented and has mistaken the absence of practice for the absence of aptitude. The 5 character flaws applied to internal life are where this chapter gets most uncomfortable. Because these are not just vulnerabilities that others exploit. They are vulnerabilities we use against ourselves. The internal quick temper, the way we speak to ourselves when we make a mistake, the savageness of our own self-criticism is often more damaging than anything an external critic could deliver. The internal excessive concern for reputation, the constant monitoring of how we appear, the self-editing before we've even acted is one of the primary mechanisms that keeps people small and safe and unfulfilled. The principle of advancing without coveting fame and retreating without fearing disgrace is perhaps the deepest idea in the chapter, and its internal application is one of the most liberating things a person can work toward. The ability to try something new without needing it to make you look good. The ability to change your mind publicly without experiencing it as humiliation. The ability to stop doing something that isn't working without having to construct a narrative that makes the stopping heroic. This is psychological freedom of a kind that most people spend their whole lives approaching but never quite reaching. Field notes. Write down 3 rules you hold about yourself, things you believe to be stable, true features of who you are and how you operate. For each one, ask, where did this rule come from? And, when did I last genuinely test whether it's still true or whether it was ever fully true? Pick the one that, if it turned out to be less fixed than you've assumed, would open up the most. Chapter Takeaway. The person who can hold their hard-won rules loosely enough to set them aside when the situation demands it, without losing their judgment or their values, is operating at a level that rigid thinkers simply cannot reach. Chapter 9. The Army on the March. Everything around you is telling you something. The question is whether you're listening. The original wisdom. Chapter 9 is unlike anything else in the art of war. After 8 chapters of strategic principles and philosophical frameworks, Sun Tzu suddenly gets forensically, almost obsessively specific. He describes how to read a landscape, where to camp near water but not in it, how to recognize an ambush from the behavior of birds overhead, what it means when the enemy's envoys speak humbly but their preparations accelerate. Page after page of precise, observational detail. At first glance it can feel like a departure, a field manual inserted into a philosophy text. But read carefully, it is the most practical expression of Sun Tzu's deepest conviction: reality is always communicating with you. Your job is to read it accurately. He begins with the physical terrain: mountains, rivers, marshes, open ground, and for each type, he gives specific guidance about how to move through it, where to position, what to avoid. The underlying principle in every case is the same: understand the nature of the ground you are on before you commit to a position. Don't set up camp in a valley that could flood. Don't march through ground you haven't scouted. Don't assume that because the path looks clear it is clear. Then he moves to something more subtle and more interesting: the art of reading signs. He lists dozens of them. When the enemy's troops lean on their spears, they are exhausted. When they draw water and drink before carrying it back, they are thirsty and poorly supplied. When birds take flight from a position, there is movement hidden beneath them. When the trees move without wind, they are being used as cover. When there is commotion in the camp at night, the men are afraid. Each of these observations is about the same thing: the gap between what is being presented and what is actually happening. Sun Tzu is training his reader to look past the surface, past what opponents want you to see, and to read the actual state of affairs from indirect evidence. This is not paranoia. It is precision. He then turns to the management of soldiers, and here the chapter takes a turn that surprises most readers. Soldiers must be treated in the first instance with humanity, but kept under control by means of iron discipline. And then, if soldiers are punished before they have grown attached to you, they will not prove submissive. The greatest commanders, Sun Tzu says, are not those who demand obedience but those who earn it through genuine care, through consistency, through being worthy of the trust they ask for. The chapter closes with one of the most quietly powerful lines in the book: if in training soldiers' commands are habitually enforced, the army will be well disciplined; if not, its discipline will be poor. Consistency is not a personality trait. It is a practice. And its effects accumulate in armies, in teams, in families, in the relationship between a person and their own word. The core principles. Reality communicates constantly through signs, signals, and patterns. Accurate reading of these is a core strategic skill. The gap between what is presented and what is actually happening is almost always readable if you know what to look for. Understand the nature of your terrain before you commit to a position. Assumptions about familiar ground are where costly mistakes begin. Indirect evidence is often more reliable than direct statement. Behavior, energy, and patterns tell truer stories than words. Trust is earned through consistent humanity before it can be sustained through discipline. Consistency between what you say and what you do is not a virtue, it is the foundation of all functional authority. Reading people and environments accurately requires genuine attention, not the performance of attentiveness, but the real thing. Briefcase apply at work. Every workplace is alive with signals that most people walk past without reading. The energy in the room before a meeting that hasn't formally started yet. The way a senior leader responds, or doesn't respond, to a particular question. The colleague whose body language and tone are slightly misaligned with their words. The project that keeps getting almost approved but never quite crosses the line. These are Sun Tzu's birds taking flight. Something is moving beneath the surface. The question is whether you notice. The ability to read an organization accurately, to understand not just what is being said but what is actually happening, not just the stated priorities but the real ones, not just the official structure but the informal power map, is one of the most valuable and least formally taught professional skills. It is the difference between the person who is consistently surprised by organizational developments and the person who saw them coming 6 months earlier and positioned accordingly. Sun Tzu's specific signs translate with remarkable directness into professional life. When communication from leadership becomes unusually formal and carefully worded, something is changing. When a previously vocal colleague goes quiet in meetings, something is shifted for them. When a project that was high priority quietly loses its executive sponsor, its fate is already decided, the announcement just hasn't been made yet. When someone who previously pushed back on every proposal suddenly agrees with everything, they have either genuinely changed their mind or they have checked out. These are not certainties. They are signals worth reading. The consistency principle, commands habitually enforced, is the most important management insight in the chapter and possibly in the whole book. The manager whose stated standards and actual standards diverge creates a particular kind of organizational damage that is slow to accumulate and very fast to spread. Once people learn that the stated expectation will not be enforced, they stop taking any stated expectation seriously. The culture that results is not one of reasonable flexibility. It is one of ambient low trust, where nobody quite knows what is real. Rebuilding it is far harder than maintaining it would have been. Field notes. Spend 1 week deliberately paying closer attention to the indirect signals in your workplace, the energy, the body language, the patterns in who speaks and who doesn't, what gets followed up and what gets quietly dropped. Keep a brief daily note. At the end of the week, ask, what did I notice that I wouldn't normally have registered? And what does it suggest about what is actually happening beneath the surface of what is being said? Office building apply in business. The businesses that navigate markets most successfully are not always the ones with the best products or the most resources. They are often the ones with the most accurate picture of reality, the ones that read what is actually happening in their market, with their customers, and in their competitive environment, rather than what they hope or assume is happening. Customer signals are the most immediately available form of Sun Tzu's signs, and the most consistently misread. The support tickets that keep raising the same issue. The feature that gets requested repeatedly in sales calls but never quite makes the product roadmap. The customers who renew but with noticeably less enthusiasm than they originally signed up with. The sales cycle that keeps stalling at the same stage. Each of these is a bird taking flight. Something is moving beneath the surface that direct questions to customers often won't reveal, either because customers don't know how to articulate it, or because they don't want to be impolite, or because the signal is in their behavior rather than their words. The gap between presented reality and actual reality is perhaps nowhere more dangerous than in a company's internal self-assessment. The management team that reads its own culture accurately, that genuinely understands the morale of its people, the real state of its key relationships, the honest assessment of its competitive position, operates in a completely different reality from the one that sees what it wants to see. Most company cultures have implicit norms around what is safe to say and what isn't. The signals that don't fit the preferred narrative get filtered out, not through conscious dishonesty, but through the very human tendency to hear what confirms what we already believe. The terrain principle, understand the ground before you commit, applies with direct force to market entry, partnership decisions, and major strategic bets. The company that moves into a new market based on surface-level research, without genuinely understanding the specific dynamics of that terrain, will discover the details in the most expensive way possible. The investors, customers, regulators, cultural norms, and competitive realities of a new market are not visible from the outside in the same way they are from the inside. The cost of learning them the hard way is almost always higher than the cost of learning them before you move. Field notes. Identify the 3 most important signals your business is currently receiving from reality, from customers, from the market, from your team, that you haven't fully processed or acted on. For each one, ask, what is this actually telling me, if I take it seriously rather than explaining it away? The signals you most want to explain away are usually the ones most worth sitting with. Red heart apply in relationships. Sun Tzu's entire approach in this chapter, read the actual state of things from indirect evidence, rather than from what is being presented, is one of the most important relational skills a person can develop. And one of the most uncomfortable, because reading accurately means being willing to see things you might prefer not to. Every close relationship has a surface level and a real level. The surface level is what is said, what is agreed to, what is performed in the normal rhythm of the relationship. The real level is the energy underneath, the actual emotional state, the genuine level of connection or distance, the things that are felt but not expressed. Most people spend most of their time in close relationships operating entirely on the surface level, hearing the words without reading the energy, responding to the stated content without noticing the actual signal. Sun Tzu's signs translate into relationship reading with sometimes startling precision. When someone who normally communicates readily becomes brief and factual, something has shifted. When a usually engaged partner becomes agreeable without being present, saying yes to everything without actually being there, something is happening that the words aren't conveying. When the laughter in a relationship changes quality, becomes more performed and less spontaneous, something in the underlying connection has moved. These are not certainties. But they are signals, and a person who reads them early has the opportunity to respond while the gap is small, rather than waiting until it has grown into something much harder to bridge. The consistency principle is the most foundational thing in this chapter for relationships. Saying and doing the same thing, over time, is the mechanism by which trust is built. Not through grand gestures or declared intentions, but through the small, daily, unremarkable alignment between word and action. The person who says they will call and calls. The person who says they care about something and shows it in their behavior. The person whose stated values and actual priorities are visibly the same thing. This consistency is not exciting. It is the foundation on which everything real in a relationship is built. Field notes. In your most important relationship, ask yourself honestly, what signals have I been receiving that I haven't fully acknowledged either to myself or to the other person? Not the dramatic things, but the quiet ones. The slight changes in energy, the things that are slightly different from how they used to be, the small recurring patterns. What are they telling you, if you read them honestly rather than reassuringly? Brain apply in your own mind. The most important environment to read accurately is not the organization you work in or the market you compete in. It is your own internal state, and this is the terrain most people are most consistently inaccurate about. We are remarkably poor self-readers, as a species. We tell ourselves we are calm when our body is in a stress response. We tell ourselves we are fine with something when our behavior is loudly contradicting the claim. We tell ourselves we are motivated and committed to a goal while every action we take is a form of avoidance. The gap between our presented internal reality and our actual one is often at least as wide as the gap Sun Tzu was reading between enemy armies. The skill of accurate self-reading begins with the same discipline Sun Tzu applied to reading terrain, paying genuine attention rather than assumed attention. Not I know roughly how I feel about this, but actually sitting with the question long enough to get a more precise answer. The body is often the most reliable signal: physical tension, disrupted sleep, changes in energy or appetite, the quality of your attention. These are the birds taking flight, the troops leaning on their spears. They are telling you something about the actual state of the territory that your narrative about yourself may not be accurately reporting. The consistency principle applied internally is about the alignment between your stated values and your actual behavior and the willingness to read the gap between them honestly when it exists. Most people know, at some level, when what they're doing doesn't match what they say they believe in. The question is whether they let themselves read that signal clearly enough to do something about it, or whether they reach for an explanation that restores the comfortable sense that everything is aligned when it isn't. The latter is a form of marching into a valley without scouting it. It feels easier in the moment. It makes the terrain more dangerous. Field notes. For 1 week, practice reading your own indirect signals. At the end of each day, note, what did my body, my energy, my behavior, and my attention tell me today separate from what I told myself I was feeling. Look specifically for the places where your internal presentation and your internal reality seem to diverge. Those divergences are the most useful information you have about what is actually happening beneath the surface. Chapter Takeaway. The most valuable intelligence you will ever gather is available for free, in every environment you inhabit, but only to the person who has learned to pay real attention rather than assumed attention. Chapter 10. Terrain. The same person, the same skills, the same plan, completely different outcomes depending on the ground you're standing on. The original wisdom. Chapter 10 is about something that sounds almost too simple to need a chapter, where you are matters. The ground beneath your feet shapes everything: what moves are available, what risks are acceptable, what the right decision actually is. And yet, Sun Tzu observes, most commanders make their plans as if terrain were a neutral backdrop rather than an active participant in the outcome. He opens by cataloging 6 types of terrain, each demanding a completely different approach. Accessible ground, where both sides can move freely, requires you to occupy the high, sunny positions first and secure your supply lines before engaging. Entangling ground, easy to enter but hard to leave, must only be entered if the enemy is unprepared, because if you advance and they are ready, retreat becomes catastrophic. Ground where neither side gains by moving first should be held, not advanced into. Narrow passes must be occupied first, or if the enemy holds them, only attacked under specific conditions. High ground held by the enemy should never be directly assaulted. And ground that is far from home requires a different kind of discipline and a different relationship to risk than ground close to your base. What runs underneath all 6 is a single discipline: read the specific situation you are actually in, not the situation you wish you were in, not the situation that resembles previous experience, not the situation your standard approach was designed for. The actual situation, with its specific constraints and specific opportunities. Then Sun Tzu does something unexpected. He turns from terrain to leadership, specifically to 6 ways that armies are defeated that have nothing to do with the enemy. Flight. Insubordination. Collapse. Ruin. Disorganization. Rout. And in every case, the cause is not the opponent's strength but the commander's failure. The general who sends troops to fight an enemy 10 times their strength will lose them. The general whose officers are strong but who has no authority will find commands ignored. The general who promotes the wrong people will see the capable ones leave or disengage. The general who is indulgent without discipline, or strict without genuine care, will lose the loyalty that makes an army function. The chapter then builds to one of Sun Tzu's most direct and bracing statements: if fighting is sure to result in victory, then you must fight, even though the ruler forbid it. If fighting will not result in victory, then you must not fight even at the ruler's bidding. This is the complete integration of terrain awareness and personal integrity. The commander who truly understands the ground they're on and who genuinely cares about the outcome rather than the appearance of compliance must be willing to act on that understanding even when it is inconvenient, unpopular, or contrary to instruction. He closes with the line that might be the most important in the chapter: know the enemy and know yourself, your victory will never be endangered. Know the ground and the skies, your victory will then be total. Self-knowledge and opponent knowledge, from Chapter 3, are necessary but not sufficient. You must also know the terrain and the conditions. All 4 together produce not just victory, but complete victory. The core principles. Terrain is not a neutral backdrop, it is an active participant in every outcome, and it must be read before any decision is made. Every type of ground demands a different approach. Applying the same tactics regardless of context is how capable people produce poor results. Most defeats come not from the opponent's strength but from internal failures of leadership, structure, and culture. Self-knowledge and opponent knowledge are necessary but not sufficient. You must also understand the specific ground you're operating on. A leader who genuinely understands the situation must be willing to act on that understanding even when it conflicts with instruction or convention. Promoting the wrong people, tolerating poor performance, and confusing indulgence with care are internal failures that erode any organization from within. Complete victory requires knowing yourself, knowing the opposition, knowing the terrain, and reading the conditions, all 4, not 3. Briefcase apply at work. The same person, with the same skills and the same approach, can thrive in one organization and struggle badly in another. This is not a mystery and it is not a character flaw. It is terrain. And most people, when they experience the struggling version, conclude something is wrong with them rather than examining whether the ground they're on is fundamentally unsuited to how they operate. Sun Tzu's 6 terrain types map onto organizational environments with uncomfortable precision. Accessible ground, where movement is free, ideas flow, and initiative is rewarded, is the environment that suits certain personalities and approaches perfectly. Entangling ground, easy to enter, hard to leave, where initial enthusiasm gives way to a sense of being stuck, is the job or organization that looked exciting from the outside and reveals its constraints only after you've committed. Narrow passes are the organizations where a small number of gatekeepers control all meaningful advancement, and where the decision about whether to enter or stay depends entirely on whether those gatekeepers are on your side. The 6 internal failure modes Sun Tzu identifies are a direct description of dysfunctional workplace dynamics, rendered in military language. Flight, capable people leaving, is not a recruitment problem. It is almost always a leadership problem, and it almost always precedes the formal recognition of a crisis by 12 to 18 months. Insubordination, where the official hierarchy exists but real authority lies elsewhere, is the organization where the org chart and the actual power map are 2 completely different documents. Collapse, where the leader is genuinely capable but the team is not, is the brilliant individual contributor who was promoted into a management role and given neither the support nor the time to develop the completely different skill set that role requires. The terrain principle has a direct and practical application for anyone making a career decision, a new role, a new organization, a new team. The questions most people ask before accepting a job are about the role itself, the responsibilities, the compensation, the title, the growth potential. Sun Tzu would ask first about the ground. What kind of organization is this, actually? What type of terrain am I entering? What are the constraints that aren't visible in the job description? Who holds the real power, and what do they actually value? What happens to people who succeed here, and what happens to the ones who don't? These are terrain questions. They determine whether your skills and approach will be assets or liabilities in this specific environment. Field notes. Think about your current professional environment. Which of Sun Tzu's terrain types does it most resemble? Accessible, entangling, contested, or something else? Then ask, is this terrain suited to how I actually operate, or am I fighting the ground as well as the work? If it's the latter, what would need to change in the environment, in your approach, or in both? Office building apply in business. Every business operates on terrain, and the most consequential terrain decisions are the ones made before the business is fully committed to a position. Market selection is a terrain decision. The startup that enters a market dominated by 1 or 2 deeply entrenched players with enormous resources and customer lock-in is choosing entangling ground, easy to enter, potentially catastrophic to exit, with a well-defended enemy already occupying the high ground. The business that identifies a market where the existing players are weak, distracted, or structurally unable to serve a particular customer segment well is choosing accessible ground and moving there first before the advantage is visible to others. Pricing and positioning are terrain decisions. The business that tries to compete in the middle of a market, not the cheapest, not the most premium, not the most specialized, is often occupying the most contested and least defensible position available. Sun Tzu would look at this and ask, what is the high ground here, and who currently holds it? The high ground in a market is usually the position that is hardest to displace: deep customer loyalty, network effects, regulatory moats, genuine technical superiority. If you don't hold it and can't take it, the strategic question is whether there is a different ground entirely where you could build something unassailable. The internal failure modes are where this chapter most directly addresses the human side of business. The business that promotes people based on technical skill into leadership roles they are not suited for, and then neither supports them nor addresses the problem when it becomes visible, is generating its own defeat. Sun Tzu is explicit: the leader who knows there is a problem and doesn't address it, out of sentiment, convenience, or conflict avoidance, is as responsible for the outcome as the person causing the problem. This is the excessive compassion flaw from Chapter 8 appearing again in a different context, and the consequence is the same. The team that needed to be led is instead being failed. Field notes. Assess the terrain of your current market position honestly. Ask, are we on high ground, a position that is genuinely hard to displace, or are we in contested middle ground that anyone with resources could enter? Then ask the internal question, where in our organization are we tolerating a known problem because addressing it feels too hard? Both answers point to where the real strategic work is. Red Heart apply in relationships. Every relationship has terrain, the specific context, history, and conditions that make it what it is, and the single most common relationship mistake is treating very different terrain as if it were all the same ground. The terrain of a relationship in its first year is completely different from the terrain of the same relationship in its 10th. The rules, the risks, the appropriate moves, the meaning of particular behaviors, all of these are shaped profoundly by context. What reads as refreshing directness in a new relationship can read as disregard for accumulated history in a long one. What is appropriately cautious behavior when trust is still being established becomes emotionally withholding once it has been. The person who applies the same approach to their relationship at year 10 as they did at year 1 is not being consistent. They are failing to read the terrain. The terrain of a relationship under stress, when one or both people are depleted, anxious, or in a period of genuine difficulty, demands something different from the terrain of a relationship in a stable, nourishing period. Sun Tzu's principle about not advancing into ground where neither side gains applies here with some force. There are moments in relationships when both people are at their lowest, when the accumulated tension has reached a point where any engagement produces more heat than light, where the right move is genuinely not to advance. Not to have the important conversation. Not to push for the resolution. To hold the ground, tend the relationship's basic well-being, and wait for conditions that make real engagement possible. The internal failure modes, the 6 ways armies defeat themselves, have relationship equivalents that are worth naming. The leadership failure of promoting the wrong people shows up in relationships as the pattern of consistently giving authority and influence to the most anxious or reactive voice in the dynamic, allowing the worst moment, the most fearful interpretation, the most defensive response to set the tone for the relationship rather than the best. The collapse failure, capable leader, inadequate team, shows up when one person in a relationship is carrying a disproportionate amount of the emotional and practical load, not because the other person can't contribute, but because no one has explicitly named the imbalance or asked for it to change. Field notes. Think about a significant relationship in your life and ask, what type of terrain are we on right now? Accessible, entangling, difficult, stable. Then ask, am I responding to the terrain we're actually on, or am I applying an approach suited to different conditions? The gap between those two things is often where persistent friction lives. Brain apply in your own mind. The terrain you carry inside yourself, the accumulated landscape of your experience, your formed beliefs, your emotional history, is the ground on which every internal decision is made. And most people navigate it almost entirely by feel, without ever having mapped it deliberately. Sun Tzu's insistence on knowing the terrain before committing to a position has a profound internal application, understanding the conditions under which your best thinking, your best decisions, and your best behavior occur, and equally, the conditions that reliably produce your worst. This is not the same as the energy management idea from Chapter 7, though it overlaps with it. It is more specific. It is about the particular types of terrain, the kinds of situations, pressures, and emotional landscapes where you are genuinely at your best and worst. Some people think most clearly under moderate pressure but lose quality rapidly when pressure becomes acute. Some people do their best relational work in one-on-one settings and become significantly less effective in groups. Some people navigate ambiguity well but struggle with repetitive, process-heavy work. These are terrain features. They are not permanent limitations and they are not fixed destinies, but they are real, and operating as if they don't exist is the equivalent of marching into entangling ground without having scouted it. The 6 internal failure modes, applied to personal life, point at something uncomfortable but genuinely useful, the ways we defeat ourselves from within, without any external opponent needing to do anything. The insubordination failure, where the official hierarchy exists but real authority lies elsewhere, shows up internally as the person whose stated values and actual drivers are completely different things. They say they value health and spend their evenings in ways that undermine it. They say they value their family and let work colonize every boundary. The stated authority, the values they identify with, exists, but the real authority, the habits, the fears, the defaults, lies somewhere else entirely. Field notes. Map your internal terrain in 2 columns. In the first, describe the conditions under which you operate at your genuine best, the type of problem, the environment, the emotional state, the kind of pressure or support that brings out your clearest thinking and most effective action. In the second, describe the conditions that reliably produce your worst, the situations, states, and dynamics where you consistently underperform your own standards. Then look at how your current life is structured. How much time are you spending on each type of ground? Chapter takeaway. Context is not the background to the decision, it is half the decision itself. The person who reads the ground they're actually on, rather than the ground they wish they were on, will consistently make better choices with the same information. Chapter 11. The 9 situations. There are moments when holding back is the most dangerous thing you can do. The original wisdom. Chapter 11 is the longest in the art of war and, in many ways, the most intense. Sun Tzu has spent 10 chapters teaching preparation, positioning, adaptability, and restraint. Now he turns to something different: what happens when the conditions are extreme, when the stakes are existential, and when the ordinary rules of careful management no longer apply. He opens by cataloging 9 types of ground, defined not by their physical characteristics but by their strategic and psychological implications. Dispersive ground, fighting on your own territory, where soldiers are tempted to scatter and go home. Facile ground, shallow penetration into enemy territory, still easy to retreat from. Contentious ground, positions of such advantage that both sides will fight hard to hold them. Open ground, where both sides move freely. Ground of intersecting highways, where alliance with neighboring powers becomes critical. Serious ground, deep in enemy territory, where many fortified cities lie behind you. Difficult ground, forests, steep passes, marshes. Hemmed-in ground, where the way in is narrow and the way out requires fighting through the enemy. And finally, desperate ground, where survival itself requires immediate, total combat. The progression is deliberate. As the situation becomes more extreme, the required response becomes more radical. On dispersive ground, Sun Tzu says, "Don't fight, keep unity." On desperate ground, he says, "Fight as if your life depends on it, because it does." The most striking passage in the chapter describes what a great general does when his army is on desperate ground, deep in enemy territory, no retreat possible, survival requiring complete commitment. He burns the boats. He destroys the food supplies. He removes every option except forward. Throw your soldiers into positions whence there is no escape, and they will prefer death to flight. If they will face death, there is nothing they cannot achieve. This is not cruelty. It is the strategic use of desperation, the recognition that human beings perform at their absolute peak when there is no alternative, and that sometimes the greatest gift a leader can give their people is the removal of the comfortable option. Sun Tzu also addresses the management of information and morale in extreme situations. Keep your plans to yourself until the last moment, not because you don't trust your people, but because premature information creates premature fear. Modify your plans according to circumstances. Give people clear direction without burdening them with uncertainty they can't act on. And move them, when necessary, without explaining every step, because understanding sometimes follows commitment, rather than preceding it. He returns, in this chapter, to the theme of unity, the army that fights as one, where every soldier trusts the others and the whole moves with single purpose, is qualitatively different from the army of individuals. And the leader who has genuinely earned that unity through consistency, through genuine care, through being trustworthy across the small moments as well as the large, commands something that no amount of tactical genius can replicate. The chapter closes with a passage about the truly skilled commander that reads almost like a portrait of calm mastery in the middle of chaos. He is stern and cannot be talked to. He dismisses all clever schemes and stops all rumors. He keeps his people's eyes and ears directed to the front, and does his work without letting them know his design. This is leadership stripped of performance, no inspiring speeches, no visible anxiety, no management of perception. Just clear direction, absolute focus, and the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. The core principles. Different levels of stakes require categorically different responses. The approach suited to moderate risk is wrong for existential stakes. Desperation, deliberately created, unlocks a level of human commitment and capability that comfort never can. Removing the option to retreat is sometimes the most powerful strategic move available. It transforms the psychology of everyone involved. Keep plans close until the moment of execution. Premature disclosure creates fear without enabling action. Unity of purpose, earned through consistent trustworthy leadership, is more powerful than any tactical advantage. The best leaders in extreme situations provide clear direction without performing confidence, calm focus, not theatrical certainty. Understanding sometimes follows commitment rather than preceding it. You don't always need to fully understand before you fully commit. Briefcase apply at work. Most professional lives are spent on dispersive ground or facile ground, situations where the stakes are real but not existential, where retreat is always available, where the comfortable option exists and is taken regularly. This is not a criticism. Most of the time, this is entirely appropriate. You don't need to burn the boats to write a good report or manage a project effectively. But there are moments, specific, identifiable moments, when the dispersive ground approach applied to an existential situation produces precisely the kind of half-committed, one foot in one foot out performance that guarantees the worst outcome. The person who wants to build something genuinely new but keeps one hand on the safety rail of their current position. The professional who knows they need to make a significant change but keeps delaying the commitment in favor of more information, more certainty, more preparation. The team that is trying to achieve something difficult but hasn't truly burned its retreat options. Everyone still has a comfortable fallback, and that fallback is present in the room at every decision point. Sun Tzu's desperate ground principle is not an argument for recklessness. It is an argument for recognizing when the situation genuinely calls for total commitment and then making that commitment fully, rather than partially. There is a specific kind of failure that comes from partial commitment to a genuinely demanding endeavor. You pay most of the cost, you absorb most of the difficulty, but you don't access the level of resourcefulness and creativity that only full commitment unlocks. You get the hard part without the breakthrough. The information management principle has a direct professional application that many leaders get wrong in both directions. Sharing every uncertainty, every risk, every possible bad outcome with a team that cannot act on the information creates fear without enabling action. It is premature disclosure that serves the leader's need for transparency more than the team's need for effective direction. But withholding information that people need to do their jobs well creates a different kind of damage, the erosion of trust that comes from people discovering they were not told things they needed to know. The discipline is to share what people can act on, when they can act on it, and to hold what would only burden them until the moment it becomes actionable. Field notes. Identify one significant professional goal or endeavor where you are currently operating with partial commitment, where the safety net is still visible and its presence is subtly shaping your choices. Ask honestly, what would full commitment look like here? What would I do differently if retreat were not an option? You don't have to burn the boats today. But write down what burning them would mean, and sit with whether the partial commitment is serving you or costing you. Office building apply in business. The most transformative moments in business history are almost always desperate ground stories. The founder who put everything, savings, reputation, security, into a venture that had to work, because there was no longer a version of not working. The company that made the irreversible strategic bet, the acquisition, the platform shift, the complete product reinvention that removed the option of returning to what had been, and in doing so, unlocked the full commitment of everyone involved. This is not survivorship bias dressed up as strategy. Sun Tzu is making a specific psychological and operational claim, that the presence of a comfortable retreat option actively reduces the quality of commitment and therefore the quality of execution. The startup that is well-funded enough that the founders could walk away comfortably is a different animal from the startup where walking away means losing everything. The second is often more focused, more creative, more willing to do the things that are genuinely hard, because the conditions leave no room for the performance of effort instead of actual results. The 9 situations framework is a genuinely useful map for assessing where a business currently sits. Dispersive ground, operating in familiar territory with easy retreat options, calls for different leadership, culture, and risk tolerance than serious ground, deep commitment to a direction, with many obligations behind you and significant distance still to cover. The mistake many businesses make is applying dispersive ground thinking, cautious, option-preserving, consensus-seeking to situations that are actually serious ground, where that level of caution simply prevents the decisive action the situation requires. The unity principle is the business dimension of this chapter that receives the least attention and deserves the most. The company whose people are genuinely aligned, not performatively aligned, not aligned in the meeting room and divergent everywhere else, but actually moving with shared purpose and mutual trust, operates with a qualitative advantage that resource and strategy alone cannot replicate. And that unity is not built through culture decks or team offsites. It is built through the consistent, daily, unremarkable alignment between what leadership says and what leadership does, through being the kind of organization whose word means something, whose stated values shape actual decisions, whose people have seen enough evidence of genuine care to trust the direction when they can't see the full map. Field notes. Assess your business honestly against the 9 situations framework. Are you on dispersive ground, still close to home, options open, commitment partial? Serious ground, deeply committed, obligations behind you, needing to push forward? Or somewhere in between? Then ask, is the level of commitment we're operating with matched to the type of ground we're actually on? A mismatch in either direction, too committed for dispersive ground, too cautious for serious ground, is where avoidable failure lives. Red heart apply in relationships. The desperate ground principle in relationships is one of the most profound and most misunderstood ideas in the chapter because it touches on something most people would rather not examine directly: the relationship between commitment and the availability of exit. Sun Tzu's observation is that the removal of retreat options transforms the psychology and therefore the behavior of everyone involved. This is not an argument against having the right to leave a relationship, it is an observation about what full commitment actually does to the quality of engagement. The person who is fully committed to a relationship, who has, in whatever internal sense is real for them, removed the maybe I'll find something better option, engages with problems, difficulties, and the hard work of genuine intimacy from a completely different position than the person who is keeping that option warm. This is not about staying in relationships that are genuinely harmful or that have reached their genuine end. Sun Tzu is clear that there are types of ground that should simply not be entered, and desperate situations that arise from having entered the wrong ground are not the same as the ones that arise from having fully committed to the right one. The distinction matters enormously. Burning the boats in a situation that genuinely calls for retreat is not heroism. It is being trapped. But for relationships that are fundamentally sound, where the ground is right, where the people genuinely want to build something together, partial commitment is one of the most reliably corrosive forces available. The relationship where both people are present but neither is fully in, where there is always a background calculation of alternatives, a subtle withholding that comes from never quite having decided, develops a kind of chronic low-grade distance that is very difficult to diagnose and very difficult to close. The couples who build something genuinely deep almost always describe a moment, not always a formal one, where they simply decided. Where the exit became, internally, unavailable. And where that decision changed how they engaged with everything that came after. The information management principle has a quietly important relationship application. Sharing every anxiety, every doubt, every worst-case scenario with a partner who cannot act on the information because the information is not about something they have done or can change, but about your own unprocessed fear, is a form of emotional burden sharing that can feel like intimacy but functions like pressure. The discipline of processing what can be processed internally, and bringing to the relationship only what the relationship can actually work with, is a form of care that mature relationships depend on. Field notes. Ask yourself, about your most important relationship, Have I fully committed in the internal, irreversible sense, or am I still, in some background way, keeping options open? This is not a question to answer quickly or lightly. Sit with it. If the honest answer is that you're partially committed to something that calls for full commitment, ask what is preventing the full decision and whether what's preventing it is wisdom or fear. Brain apply in your own mind. The 9 situations are not just external circumstances. They are internal states, and the most important desperate ground you will ever stand on is the one inside your own psychology where you finally decide that the comfortable option is no longer available. Most significant personal transformations follow this structure. The person who finally addresses the health problem they have been managing around for years doesn't do it because more information arrived. They do it because something shifted internally, the retreat option closed, the comfortable story stopped working, the cost of continuing became undeniable. The person who finally leaves the situation that has been draining them doesn't leave because conditions changed. They leave because they reached their internal desperate ground, the place where staying became as unacceptable as the difficulty of leaving. This is Sun Tzu's deepest insight in the chapter, applied to personal life, the level of human performance, resourcefulness, and genuine change that desperate ground unlocks is qualitatively different from anything that comfortable ground produces. Not better in every way, the stress is real, the cost is real, the difficulty is real. But the clarity is extraordinary. On desperate ground, the irrelevant falls away. The performance of trying stops. The actual question, what do I need to do, right now, to get through this, becomes the only question, and it tends to get answered with a directness and creativity that the comfortable version of the same person couldn't access. The leadership principle from this chapter, stern, focused, dismissing clever schemes, keeping people's attention on the front, has a powerful internal application for the moments when your own mind is generating chaos. The internal leadership response to acute difficulty is not to engage with every anxious thought, explore every catastrophic scenario, or allow the rumor mill of your own cognition to run unchecked. It is to identify the one thing that needs to happen next, and direct your full attention there. The calm authority that Sun Tzu describes in The Great Commander is available internally too, but it requires the same discipline, clear direction, dismissed distractions, eyes on the front. Field notes. Identify one area of your life where you have been operating in a partial commitment, where the comfortable option is still available and its availability is shaping your choices in ways that are costing you. Ask, what would change in my thinking, my behavior, my daily choices if that option were genuinely no longer available? Write the answer in detail. Then ask the harder question, is the comfortable option actually serving me, or is its presence the main thing preventing the level of engagement this situation requires? Chapter takeaway. Full commitment is not recklessness, it is the recognition that some things can only be achieved by people who have stopped leaving themselves a way out. Chapter 12. Attack by fire. Knowing when to burn something down is wisdom. Doing it in anger is just destruction. The original wisdom. Chapter 12 opens with something that feels almost shockingly concrete after the philosophical depth of Chapter 11. Sun Tzu catalogs 5 targets for fire attack: burning the enemy's soldiers in their camp, burning their stores, burning their equipment, burning their arsenals, and using fire to create chaos and confusion in their ranks. He lists the conditions required: the right season, the right weather, the right wind. Fire, he says, is an extraordinary weapon, but only when deployed with precision, preparation, and an absolute understanding of the conditions in which it will be used. Then he says something that elevates the entire chapter from tactics to wisdom. Now, before you use fire, be sure you have the means of support. After the fire starts, wait for it to reach its height, and then attack from the front. If the enemy does not respond, wait, do not attack. The discipline being demanded here is extraordinary. You have set the fire. Everything is burning. And Sun Tzu says, wait. Watch. Do not move until you can see exactly what the fire has done and what the conditions now are. The impulse to act the moment something dramatic happens, to capitalize immediately, to charge in while the chaos is at its peak, is precisely the impulse he is restraining. He then draws a distinction that is the moral and strategic heart of the chapter. there is a time for burning and a time for water. Not everything should be burned. And even when fire is the right tool, timing determines whether it serves your objective or destroys the very thing you were trying to win. The chapter moves then to something unexpected, a meditation on the relationship between anger, military action, and irreversibility. The enlightened ruler is prudent, and the good general is full of caution. And then, move not unless you see an advantage, use not your troops unless there is something to be gained, fight not unless the position is critical. These three tests, advantage, gain, criticality, are the filters that should precede every significant action. Not whether you feel ready, not whether you feel provoked, not whether the moment feels right emotionally. Whether the action serves the objective. And then the passage that makes this chapter genuinely important beyond military strategy: anger may in time change to gladness, vexation may be succeeded by content. But a kingdom that has once been destroyed can never come again into being, nor can the dead ever be brought back to life. Some things, once done, cannot be undone. The scorched earth that wins the battle may poison the soil for a generation. The relationship burned in a moment of fury cannot be simply rebuilt because the fury passed. The reputation destroyed in an impulsive act does not recover because the person regrets it. Sun Tzu is not arguing for passivity or conflict avoidance. He is arguing for something more demanding: the discipline to bring full force to bear when the conditions are right, and to hold that force completely when they are not, even when every instinct is screaming to act. The core principles. Fire is a tool of extraordinary power. It requires extraordinary precision, preparation, and timing to be useful rather than destructive. Dramatic action creates the impulse to act immediately. The discipline is to wait, observe, and move only when the conditions are clear. Three tests should precede every significant action. Is there genuine advantage? Is there something real to gain? Is the situation genuinely critical? Anger passes. Destruction doesn't. The emotional state that prompted an action will change, the consequences of the action will remain. Some things, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. The irreversibility of certain actions must be weighed before they are taken, not after. The discipline to hold full force in reserve, to not act when every instinct says act, is the rarest and most valuable form of self-command. Winning the moment at the cost of the long game is not victory. It is a more expensive form of defeat. Briefcase apply at work. Every workplace has fire available: the escalation, the confrontation, the email that names what everyone has been avoiding, the formal complaint, the resignation, the public disagreement that changes the dynamic of a team permanently. These are not inherently wrong moves. Sometimes they are exactly the right ones. Sun Tzu is not telling you never to use fire. He is telling you to meet the conditions before you light it. The three tests: advantage, gain, criticality, applied before any significant professional escalation will prevent a remarkable percentage of the damage that impulsive workplace fire causes. Is there genuine advantage to this action? Will it actually improve the situation, or will it simply feel satisfying in the moment? Is there something real to gain, a specific, concrete outcome that this action is likely to produce? And is the situation genuinely critical? Does this actually require fire, or does it just feel that way because you are angry or frustrated right now? Most workplace fires fail one or more of these tests and get lit anyway. The angry email sent at 11 p.m. after a frustrating day. The escalation to senior leadership triggered by wounded pride rather than genuine necessity. The resignation announced impulsively after a bad week, before the person has another position confirmed. In each case, the fire itself may have been justifiable, the frustration real, the problem genuine, but the conditions weren't right, the timing wasn't right, and the irreversibility of the action wasn't fully weighed before it was taken. The wait after the fire starts principle is one of the most practically useful ideas in the chapter for professional life. When something significant happens, a conflict escalates, a decision goes badly, a relationship ruptures, the impulse is to act immediately, to respond, to get ahead of it. Sun Tzu says, watch first. Let the fire reach its height before you move. Understand what has actually happened, how people have actually responded, what the new terrain actually looks like before you commit to a course of action that may be impossible to reverse. The irreversibility principle deserves its own moment of attention in the professional context. Careers are long. Industries are smaller than they appear. The senior person you burned a bridge with at 28 has a reasonable chance of being in a position to affect your options at 45. The reputation for being difficult, impulsive, or retaliatory, once established, is extraordinarily difficult to shift, not because people don't change, but because the story that formed is more durable than the reality it was based on. This is not an argument for swallowing every injustice. It is an argument for ensuring that when you do burn something, you have fully accounted for what the ash will look like. Field notes. Think of a professional situation where you currently feel the impulse toward fire, toward escalation, confrontation, or a significant irreversible action. Run it through Sun Tzu's 3 tests. Is there genuine advantage? Is there something real to gain? Is the situation genuinely critical? Then ask the 4th question he implies but doesn't state explicitly: what does this look like in 5 years, from a distance? If the action still passes all 4, it may well be the right move. If it fails any of them, wait. Office building apply in business. Business fire comes in many forms: the aggressive competitive move, the public statement that burns a bridge with a partner or platform, the price war, the lawsuit, the dramatic restructuring, the public departure of a key person handled badly. All of these are fire. All of them can be the right tool in the right conditions. And all of them share the characteristic that Sun Tzu identified: once set, they cannot be unset, and the direction they burn is not always the direction you intended. The prepare the conditions before you light the fire principle is a direct challenge to the impulsive, reactive mode that many businesses operate in under competitive pressure. The company that announces a major strategic pivot before it has the capability to execute it has lit a fire without the supporting means, and now has to perform the pivot under the pressure of having announced it, with competitors who have been alerted and customers who are watching. The business that enters a price war without the cost structure to sustain it has set a fire that may consume it before it consumes the enemy. Sun Tzu's meditation on irreversibility has a specific and important business application: the decisions that change what a brand means to people. A brand built on quality that discounts heavily and repeatedly to chase short-term revenue has burned something, the premium perception, that may take years to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all. A company that has built its identity around a particular value and then visibly violates it in pursuit of growth has done the same. The emotional state of the leadership team at the moment of the decision, the quarterly pressure, the competitive anxiety, the frustration with the pace of growth, will pass. The reputational consequence will remain. The 3 tests applied to business decisions are a genuine discipline that most organizations would benefit from building into their decision-making culture. Before any significant irreversible action, entering a legal dispute, making a public statement about a competitor, exiting a market, announcing a major strategic change, ask whether the genuine advantage, the concrete gain, and the true criticality are all present. Not the felt advantage, the hoped for gain, and the emotionally experienced criticality. The real versions of all 3. Field notes. Identify one significant business decision currently under consideration, something that, once done, would be difficult or impossible to reverse. Before moving forward, apply Sun Tzu's full discipline. What specifically are the conditions that need to be in place before this is the right move? Are those conditions present now, or are we feeling the pressure to act before they are? The discipline of waiting for the right conditions is not indecision. It is the thing that separates effective force from expensive waste. Red Heart apply in relationships. The most important application of this chapter, the one with the highest stakes and the most lasting consequences, is in the close relationships where fire is most available and most dangerous. Every significant relationship has fire available. The words that, once said, change what the relationship is. The disclosure that cannot be undisclosed. The betrayal of trust that may be survived but is never truly forgotten. The ultimatum delivered in anger that restructures the dynamic permanently regardless of how it resolves. The thing said at maximum emotional intensity that was true in the moment but truer than you meant, in a way that the other person will carry forward. Sun Tzu's central observation that anger passes, but destruction remains is the most important sentence in this chapter for anyone who has ever said something in a moment of fury that they spent years wishing they could take back. The emotional state that prompted the words felt permanent and overwhelming in the moment. It was not permanent. It passed, as it always does. What did not pass was the knowledge in the other person's mind that you were capable of those words, in that tone, about them. That knowledge changes the relationship subtly, permanently, in ways that are very difficult to fully repair. The 3 tests applied to relationship fire are genuinely useful. Before the escalation, the ultimatum, the said out loud thing that cannot be unsaid, is there genuine advantage? Will this actually improve the situation, or will it only release pressure? Is there something real to gain, a specific, honest outcome this action is designed to achieve? And is the situation genuinely critical? Does it actually require this level of intensity, or is the intensity a reflection of your current emotional state rather than the objective stakes? None of this means important things should remain unsaid. Sun Tzu is not arguing for suppression. Some fires in relationships are necessary: the clearing of accumulated tension, the honest confrontation of something that has been avoided too long, the naming of a pattern that must change. But these fires work best when they are set with intention, when the conditions are right, and when the goal is warmth and light rather than simply the release of pressure. The difference between fire as tool and fire as emotional discharge is the difference between a difficult conversation that moves a relationship forward and a conflagration that leaves both people standing in the ash. Field notes. Think of a situation in an important relationship where you feel the pull toward fire, towards saying the thing, making the ultimatum, escalating to a level you haven't been to before. Ask Sun Tzu's question before anything else: is this anger that will pass, or is this a genuine signal that something critical needs to change? If it's the former, wait. If it's the latter, ask what the fire needs to accomplish, what the specific, positive outcome is, and whether the way you're planning to light it is likely to produce that outcome or simply to burn. Brain apply in your own mind. The internal version of this chapter is about one of the most fundamental and most difficult aspects of being a person: the relationship between your emotional states and your actions, specifically, the gap between feeling something intensely and letting that feeling dictate what you do. Sun Tzu's observation about anger and irreversibility is a complete theory of emotional regulation disguised as military strategy. The emotional state is real. The intensity is real. The feeling that action is urgently required is real. And yet, the feeling will change. The anger will soften. The humiliation will fade. The certainty that this is unbearable will, with time, reveal itself as an intense but temporary experience rather than a permanent truth. What will not change is what you did while the feeling was at its peak. The discipline being asked for here is not suppression, the pretense that the fire doesn't exist or doesn't matter. It is the far more demanding practice of feeling the full intensity of the emotional state while simultaneously holding the question: is this the moment to act, or is this the moment to wait? This is one of the hardest things a human being can do. It runs directly against the grain of how strong emotions function. They are specifically designed to produce urgent action, to feel like they require an immediate response, to make waiting feel intolerable. The 3 tests applied to internal fire decisions: advantage, gain, criticality, are a practical tool for the moments when the impulse to act is strongest. Not "do I feel like doing this?" That question is answered by the emotion, which is not a reliable guide at peak intensity. But, does acting on this, in this way, at this moment, serve something I actually care about? Is there a concrete positive outcome this action is designed to achieve? And is the situation genuinely requiring action now, or is the urgency a product of the emotional state rather than the actual circumstances? The irreversibility principle, applied internally, is about the relationship between actions and the self-story they create. Some things you do, in the fire of a difficult moment, become part of how you see yourself, and not always in useful ways. The impulsive decision made at peak desperation that you spend years second-guessing. The bridge burned in anger that you find yourself grieving long after the anger passed. The thing said or done that becomes, in your own mind, evidence of a version of yourself you don't want to be. These are the internal consequences of fire used without the conditions being right, and they can be as lasting as any external one. Field notes. Identify your personal fire signature, the specific emotional state, the specific type of situation that most reliably produces your impulsive, fire-based responses. Describe it precisely. What does it feel like in your body? What thought pattern accompanies it? What does it make you want to do? Then design one specific pause, a physical action, a question you ask yourself, or rule you have pre-committed to that you can deploy in that specific state before you act. The pause doesn't have to be long. It has to be real. Chapter takeaway. The most powerful version of you is not the one who acts on every fire, it is the one who can hold the full intensity of a difficult moment and still choose whether to burn. Chapter 13. The use of intelligence. Everything in this book is worthless without accurate information. Know what is actually true. The original wisdom. Sun Tzu closes The Art of War not with a rousing call to battle, not with a summary of everything that has come before, but with a chapter about knowledge, specifically, about the unglamorous, essential, often undervalued work of finding out what is actually true before you act on what you assume to be true. He opens with a statement that reframes every chapter that preceded it: foreknowledge cannot be elicited from spirits, it cannot be obtained inductively from experience, nor by any deductive calculation. Knowledge of the enemy's dispositions can only be obtained from other men. In other words, no amount of theory, intuition, or abstract reasoning replaces real information from real sources. The most sophisticated strategic mind in the world, operating on false or incomplete information, will produce sophisticated errors. The quality of your decisions is bounded, absolutely, by the quality of your information. He then catalogs 5 types of intelligence agents: local spies, inward spies, converted spies, doomed spies, and surviving spies, and explains the specific role each plays in building a complete picture of the enemy's situation. The detail is extraordinary for a text of this age. He is not speaking in abstractions. He is describing a functional intelligence system, people inside the enemy's organization, people from the local population who know the terrain, converted enemy agents who can be turned to your advantage, agents sent with false information to shape what the enemy believes, and agents who return with real intelligence from behind the lines. What runs underneath all of this technical detail is a conviction so strong it shapes the entire chapter: the investment in real knowledge is always worth it. Sun Tzu says that a general who begrudges the cost of good intelligence, who is too cheap, too proud, or too impatient to do the work of genuinely understanding the situation, will lose everything in the field that he saved in the preparation. The cost of not knowing is always higher than the cost of finding out. He writes about the converted spy, the enemy agent turned to your side, with particular emphasis. This is the most valuable of all intelligence assets, because a person who knows the enemy from the inside, and who is now working for you, can tell you things that no amount of external observation could reveal. To use such a person well requires, Sun Tzu says, exceptional wisdom, humanity, and subtlety. You must treat them with genuine care, because they are taking genuine risk. And you must understand that the intelligence they provide is worth more than almost anything else available to you. He closes with a passage that brings the entire book full circle back to the knowing of self and enemy that he introduced in Chapter 3, now elevated to its fullest expression. Hence it is only the enlightened ruler and the wise general who will use the highest intelligence of the army for purposes of spying, and thereby they achieve great results. Spies are a most important element in water, because on them depends an army's ability to move. Without intelligence, nothing moves. Without accurate knowledge of the terrain, the enemy, and the conditions, every principle in this book becomes a sophisticated way of acting on bad assumptions. The core principles. No amount of theory, intuition, or experience substitutes for real, current, accurate information about the actual situation. The investment in genuine knowledge always costs less than the consequences of acting on false or incomplete information. The most valuable intelligence comes from people who are inside the situation, who know it from the inside out. Treating your sources of real information with genuine care, respect, and humanity is not sentiment, it is strategic necessity. False information, deliberately planted and carefully managed, is as powerful as true information. Both shape decisions and outcomes. The quality of every decision in this book is bounded by the quality of the information it is based on. Intelligence is not support for strategy, it is the foundation of it. The enlightened leader invests in knowing what is actually true as a first priority, not as an afterthought. Briefcase apply at work. There is a particular kind of professional confidence that is built entirely on unexamined assumptions, and it is one of the most dangerous states a capable person can occupy. The manager who is certain they know how their team is doing without ever asking genuine questions. The professional who is sure they understand the political landscape of their organization without having tested that understanding against reality. The person who believes they know what their manager thinks of them based on a handful of signals they have interpreted through their own hopes and anxieties rather than through actual inquiry. Sun Tzu's intelligence principle, applied to professional life, starts with a discipline that sounds simple and is genuinely difficult, regularly and systematically finding out what is actually true, rather than operating on what you assume or prefer to be true. This requires asking questions you might not like the answers to. It requires creating conditions where people around you can tell you real things, which means demonstrating, consistently, that you can receive real things without punishing the messenger. And it requires being honest with yourself about the difference between information and reassurance, between what you sought out to genuinely understand the situation and what you sought out to feel better about it. The converted spy principle has a direct professional equivalent, the person who has been on the other side of a dynamic you're trying to understand and who is willing to tell you honestly what it looked like from there. The colleague who used to work for the competitor you're now entering a market against. The former employee who left the organization you're considering joining. The person who was in the room when the decision was made that you're now trying to understand. These are your most valuable intelligence sources, not because they are infallible, but because they have a quality of inside knowledge that external observation cannot replicate. Treating them with genuine respect and real reciprocity, not just extracting what you need and moving on, is what makes them willing to tell you the true things rather than the comfortable ones. The information management dimension of this chapter points at something that derails many professional relationships, the tendency to act on second-hand, filtered, or outdated information as if it were current and direct. The assumption about a colleague's intentions based on something someone else reported. The belief about an organization's culture based on a Glassdoor review from 3 years ago. The understanding of a client's needs based on what the account manager summarized rather than what the client actually said. In each case, you are operating on processed intelligence rather than primary sources, and the processing always involves loss. Wherever possible, go to the source. Field notes. Identify one significant assumption you are currently operating on in your professional life, something you believe to be true about your situation, your organization, or the people around you that you have not actually verified through direct inquiry. Ask, what would I need to do to find out whether this is actually true? Then do that thing, and pay close attention to whether the reality matches the assumption. The gap, when it exists, is the most useful professional information you can have. Office building apply in business. The graveyard of failed businesses contains, in overwhelming proportion, companies that acted on what they believed their customers wanted rather than what their customers actually wanted and discovered the gap too late, when the cost of closing it exceeded the resources available to do so. Customer intelligence is the most important form of intelligence a business can invest in and the most consistently underinvested. Not the survey that asks customers to rate their satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 10. Not the NPS score that gives a number without a reason. But the genuine, curious, unhurried conversation that tries to understand the customer's actual experience, what problem they were trying to solve, how well the solution actually worked, what they wished were different, what they tell their colleagues and friends when they describe what you do. This kind of intelligence is available to almost every business at almost any stage. The businesses that build it into their operating rhythm, that treat customer reality as alive, current input rather than a historical dataset, make categorically better decisions than the ones that rely on assumption. The converted spy principle in business is the competitive intelligence that comes from people who have been inside your competitors, your market, or your customer base and are now accessible to you. Former employees of competitors who join your organization bring an inside view that is worth more, strategically, than almost any amount of external research. Customers who have switched from a competitor to you and who are willing to explain honestly why are telling you something about the actual difference in value that your own marketing assumptions may not have captured. Treating these people as genuine intelligence assets, investing in understanding their experience fully rather than cherry-picking the flattering parts, is what separates the businesses with an accurate picture of their competitive position from the ones with a reassuring one. Sun Tzu's point about the cost of not investing in intelligence has a direct financial translation that most businesses understand conceptually but consistently violate in practice. The cost of a wrong strategic bet made on bad information almost always exceeds, often by an order of magnitude, the cost of the research that would have revealed the bet was wrong before it was made. The product built for a customer need that was assumed rather than verified. The market entered on the basis of surface-level research that missed a critical local dynamic. The partnership pursued because it looked right from the outside without understanding what the other organization was actually like to work with. In each case, the savings made by not investing in real intelligence became the down payment on a very expensive lesson. Field notes. Identify the most important assumption currently baked into your business strategy, the thing that, if it turned out to be wrong, would most significantly change what you should be doing. Ask, how did we arrive at this assumption, through direct evidence, or through inference and preference? Then ask, what would it cost to genuinely test this assumption before we go further? The ratio of that cost to the cost of being wrong is almost always the most compelling business case for intelligence investment you will ever construct. Red Heart apply in relationships. The closest relationships in our lives are also the ones where we most consistently act on assumption rather than knowledge, and where the cost of that gap between assumption and reality is most personal and most lasting. We develop, over time, a model of the people we are closest to, a running picture of who they are, what they need, what they feel, what they think about us and about the relationship. This model is built from real information, from years of experience, from genuine knowledge. But it is also, inevitably, out of date. People change. Needs shift. The person you were in a relationship with at year 2 is not the person you were in a relationship with at year 12, and the model built in year 2, never updated, will increasingly misread the person in front of you. Sun Tzu's intelligence principle applied to relationships is a call for ongoing genuine inquiry, the kind of real curiosity about the actual current experience of the person you are closest to that most long-term relationships gradually allow to atrophy. Not how is your day as a ritual exchange, but the actual question, what is your life like right now, from the inside? What are you finding hard that you haven't mentioned? What do you need that you haven't asked for? These questions feel unnecessary when you think you already know the answers. They become essential when you realize how long it has been since you actually checked. The converted spy principle has a genuinely useful relationship application that sounds odd but points at something real: the value of perspectives on your relationship from people who have enough outside view to see what you can't see from inside it. The trusted friend who observes your dynamic with a partner and reflects honestly on what they see. The therapist or counselor who can name the pattern that is invisible to both people inside it precisely because they are inside it. The family member who, with care and appropriate boundaries, can tell you something true about how a dynamic looks from the outside. These are intelligence sources. Treating their perspective with genuine seriousness, not defensively, not selectively, is one of the most valuable things you can do for the health of your most important relationships. The false information principle, the deliberate planting of intelligence to shape the opponent's picture of reality, has a sober relationship application that is worth naming directly: the ways in which the picture we present of ourselves in our closest relationships diverges from reality. Not through malicious deception, but through the very human tendency to manage how we appear, to present the version of ourselves that we want seen rather than the version that is actually operating. The relationship that is built on managed presentation rather than genuine visibility is a relationship built on a false intelligence picture, and it is, to that degree, a relationship with a version of you that doesn't exist. The courage of genuine self-disclosure, showing the real terrain, not the curated map, is the foundational intelligence investment that makes real intimacy possible. Field notes. Ask yourself, about your most important relationship, when did I last genuinely update my model of this person? Ask the real questions, listen for the current reality, rather than operating on the picture I built some time ago. Then ask the reverse, how accurately do I think this person currently sees me, and how much of that is because I have been genuinely visible, versus managing my presentation? Both questions point toward the same thing, the gap between the intelligence picture and the reality, and what it would take to close it. Brain apply in your own mind. The final and most important intelligence operation in this book is the one directed inward, the genuine, rigorous, ongoing work of finding out what is actually true about yourself, rather than operating on the story you have constructed about yourself over time. Most people have a self-model, a picture of who they are, what they're capable of, what they value, what they want, that was substantially formed some time ago and has been maintained largely through selective attention ever since. Information that confirms the model is registered and remembered. Information that challenges it is explained away, minimized, or simply not taken in. This is not pathology. It is a universal feature of how human beings process self-relevant information. But its consequence is that the self-model drifts gradually away from the actual self, becoming a maintained story rather than a current map. Sun Tzu's intelligence discipline applied internally begins with the same question he asks about any strategic situation: what is actually true here, and how do I know? Applied to yourself, this means taking seriously the feedback you receive that you don't like, not because all criticism is accurate, but because the consistent themes in critical feedback are almost always pointing at something real that the self-model has edited out. It means paying attention to the gap between what you say you value and what your actual choices demonstrate you value, because the choices are primary intelligence and the self-report is processed intelligence, and the processing always involves loss. The converted spy principle applied internally is one of the most powerful and most underused personal development tools available, finding people who have seen you from the outside, who know you well enough to have a real view, and who trust you enough to tell you something true, and then asking them the questions that your self-protective instincts would prefer to avoid. What do you see when you observe how I behave under pressure? What pattern do you notice in the things I consistently struggle with? What do I say I want that my behavior seems to contradict? These are intelligence questions. The answers are primary source material about the terrain of yourself, more reliable, in many cases, than your own internal account. The foundational insight of the chapter, that foreknowledge cannot come from calculation or experience alone, but must come from real sources, applies to self-knowledge with its fullest force. You cannot think your way to an accurate self-picture. You cannot derive it from your own emotional states, which are not neutral observers of the territory. You need real information, from real sources, received with the genuine openness to let it change what you believed. This is the most difficult intelligence operation of all. It is also the one that everything else depends on. Field notes. Identify one person in your life who knows you well enough to see you clearly and who you trust enough to tell you something true. Ask them one of the following questions, and then listen, without defending, explaining, or immediately reframing. What do you think is the thing I most consistently underestimate about myself? Or, what pattern do you notice in the situations where I get in my own way? Write down what they say before you evaluate it. Sit with it for at least 24 hours before you decide what to do with it. The intelligence you receive may be the most valuable you ever gather. Chapter Takeaway. All the strategy in the world is only as good as the information it stands on, and the most important information you will ever gather is the truth about what is actually happening, in your world and in yourself, right now. Conclusion. You have now spent 13 chapters in the company of one of the most precise strategic minds in human history. You have followed his thinking from the initial discipline of laying plans all the way through to the final, foundational insistence on knowing what is actually true. And if this book has done its job, you are not finishing it with a collection of interesting ideas about ancient warfare. You are finishing it with a set of living tools, specific, tested, applicable for the actual conditions of your actual life. But before you close the book, it is worth stepping back from the individual chapters and asking what all of this, taken together, is really saying. Because Sun Tzu's 13 chapters are not 13 separate lessons. They are one lesson, expressed 13 different ways. And understanding that single underlying lesson is what turns a collection of strategic principles into a coherent way of moving through the world. The one idea. At its deepest level, the art of war is about the relationship between clarity and action. Not action alone. Sun Tzu has no patience for the person who simply charges forward, driven by energy and confidence, without having thought carefully about what they are doing and why. And not clarity alone. The person who understands everything perfectly but never commits, never moves, never brings their full force to bear at the decisive moment, achieves nothing. The entire book is a discipline for developing the kind of clarity that makes action effective and the kind of action that clarity makes possible. Know yourself. Know your situation. Know the terrain. Know the conditions. Know the other party. Then move decisively, at the right moment, with the right force, in the right direction. That is the whole of it. Everything else is elaboration. A final word. Sun Tzu ends the art of war with intelligence, with the insistence that everything depends on knowing what is actually true. It is a fittingly humble note for a text of such ambition. After 13 chapters of strategic wisdom, the final message is, none of this works without honesty. Without the willingness to see clearly, to know yourself accurately, to update your picture of reality when the evidence requires it. That honesty with yourself, about your situation, about what you actually want and what it actually costs, is the foundation the entire book rests on. It is also, not coincidentally, the foundation that every well-lived life rests on. You have the principles now. You have the framework. You have, in the field notes scattered through every chapter, a set of starting points for putting them into practice. The rest is yours. The battlefield is different now. The principles are not. And you, having read this far, having sat with these ideas long enough to let them begin to take shape in relation to your actual life, are more prepared than most people who will ever face the situations you are about to walk back into. Go. Think before you move. Know the ground. Choose the right moment. And when the moment comes, act completely. The general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country and do good service, is the jewel of the kingdom. Sun Tzu, The Art of War.